I like that a lot. Like,
isn't that what you would ask someone, like, if like you and I got hit by a bus tomorrow, and then like you're in heaven and your buddies
100%.
You'd be like, hey,
100%. Yeah, I'd never thought of it that way. But I would like to ask them, like, do my sons know you?
Yeah, did they grow up with you? Were you around?
Yeah, I would like for them to. What's up, guys? I'm here to tell you this episode is brought to you by Crowd Health. Crowd Health is a new, fast-growing, tech-enabled, well-capitalized, community-powered alternative to traditional health insurance. Founded by Andy Schoonover, a proven founder and entrepreneur with a successful track record, including a $100 million plus exit. By the way, Andy's been on this podcast in the past. Crowd Health uses the power of crowdfunding, member ratings, unlimited choice, and huge cash pay discounts to provide a simple, considerably less expensive solution to managing your medical bills. Crowd Health gives you full agency and sticks with you no matter where you move or what jobs you take on. You've heard of Big Pharma, but you may not know Big Insurance is actually the man behind the curtain. With 12 of the last 15 heads of the FDA taking jobs in Big Pharma and 64% of its funding coming from private industry, don't hold your breath waiting for the government to save the day. It's safe to say our system's broken. It's time to take your well-being into your own hands, and Crowd Health helps you do just that. You'll pay into your individual account monthly, and if you ever want to leave, you'll simply pay a $250 closing fee, and they will return the entire balance in your account to you because it's your account. Because it's crowdfunded, we all have a vested interest in each other's health. They even cover up to $300 a year in routine wellness visits. So far, for every $100 members have paid into their accounts, an average of only $30 has been paid out. So you can expect to see your money grow in your account over time. Take that, Big Insurance. Join today by visiting joincrowdhealth.com and using the promo code KLP to pay only $99 a month for the first 3 months. That's joincrowdhealth.com, promo code KLP. Joincrowdhealth.com. Get you some. All right, Ryan Huber, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Ken.
Do you want to tell people who you are and what you do? Let's start there.
Sure. I am a full-time dad and a part-time professor of Christian ethics at Fuller Theological Seminary. I have a PhD in Christian ethics and church history, and I do some teaching at my church, which is Church of the City downtown here in Nashville, Tennessee. And I also write books that very few people read, but we're going to see what we can do about that.
Yeah. What other degrees do you have? Because you have a little handful over there, right?
I have a THM from Boston College, which is a Catholic Jesuit school. And then I have a master's, an MA in religion from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and a little bachelor's in history and political science from Florida Atlantic University. So.
Do you love to learn, or
yeah,
what's going on here?
So I got my bachelor's, and I was a children's minister in Fort Lauderdale at a mega church, and then I married my youth group sweetheart, who we've been married for about 16 and a half years now, and I would lay awake at night asking her all these questions of what she thought about all these theological things, and about 6 months into the marriage, she said, "You need to go back to school," so because I don't care. She's like, I love God, but I don't care about all these questions. Like, okay. She's a musician. She's super smart, but she didn't want to be my midnight, dark night of the soul, wandering partner. So through a series of crazy events, I started doing a nights and weekends master's degree down in South Florida, which Miami Christian College had kind of gone under financially. They'd been rescued by TEDS, by Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, which is in Deerfield, Illinois. And so they had kind of come in and made it the South Florida campus, so they would fly down some of their big-name professors during the dead of winter from the Chicago area to South Florida. Not a hard sell. And they had a little condo they would put up the professors in, and they'd do these weekend seminars, and we'd do all our reading and our homework in between these weekends.
Okay.
So it was kind of a nights and weekends thing, but Once I caught that bug, it was over. Like I was like, I want to do a PhD. I want to figure out, like, I want to go all the way, because I love teaching and I love people, but the subject matter was equally interesting to me. And so if you teach high schoolers like I had been doing, and before that you teach middle schoolers or young kids, and you keep going up and up and up, and you're teaching 9th graders and then 10th graders and then 11th graders, and you're like, man, I'd love to go to the next level. Well, that's 10 years of your life and $200,000 and a PhD.
And here you are.
And here we are.
Yeah.
So I'm a part-time college professor because I'm in my 30s, and all the good jobs are taken by people in their 60s and 70s. So you kind of have to wait for the inevitable if you want a job in academia. And academia has been going through a shift. Some might say a bubble bursting with sort of the student loan stuff over the last 50 years kind of pumping up the marketplace. And so we're seeing a deflation of academia. So I've had to kind of be quick on my feet and figure out what's going on and do other things. And thankfully, my wife is a fairly successful film composer, which means she writes music for TV and movies. So she's probably always going to be the primary breadwinner, and I'll just supplement because there's more demand for the services of a film composer than there is for a theologian these days.
By the way, I turned the music off. Good grief. I had Sturgill Simpson playing on here, and I meant to turn it off before we started this podcast, and I heard it through my headphones, so that's off now.
There was a little ambiance to it.
Yeah.
People are going to be like, what was going on? Is this a party?
Okay, so there was one thing I wanted to ask about this. So back you're married 6 months or whatever it was. Yep. At this point, you have no schooling, but you're a youth minister?
At that point, I was transitioning from being a children's minister to teaching at the high school. That was like a Christian high school affiliated with, and I had a bachelor's in history.
Okay.
So this was just like, I just graduated. We were very young. We got married when I was 21.
Okay.
So I was just kind of like, this is a job. This is great. But then when she was like, hey, you might want to go back to school, that kind of started all the master's degrees and everything. So
do you plan to, I guess, what's the career track look like? Do you plan to teach or be a professor at some point?
If it presented itself.
Okay.
I think I'm a little weird for that. I think I like to do a lot of different things. So, for example, for the last 10 years, I've been learning how to write for a popular audience, meaning books that hopefully get read by hundreds of thousands of people rather than tens of people, right? So translating an academic voice into a relatable voice has been a project over time.
Okay.
The good thing is I'm a little bit of a weirdo for an academic because I like things like football and beer, I like normal people things. And so some of my academic colleagues are a bit different. They like the library. They like to be in the library. And I'm more of I like doing this. I like talking to people. And, we met at a coffee shop.
Well, I love that because, and also I wanted to say this about your book, which I didn't tell you like, hey, let's talk about your book, but you wrote it somewhat recently. So I do want to talk about your book.
Cool. And this is the How to Read the Bible book.
Yes.
Which is not yet officially published. So Kent got like what we call an ARC, which is an advanced reader copy, which is totally fine. But we're still talking to publishers about that. Okay.
Yeah. So I had the inside scoop on that.
Yes.
What's it going to be called? The title?
So what we want to put it out as is a 5-volume like set of really short books, like 150 pages, 160 pages. How to Read the Bible is the first one. So the whole series is called Formation.
Yes.
So the first one, Formation, How to Read the Bible. The second one, Formation, Matthew, A Reader's Guide, then Mark, then Luke, then John. And so it's essentially a journey through how to read the Gospels and then reading the Gospels for spiritual formation.
Yes.
That's the idea.
Colby, is his mic cutting out or is it just...
I don't think so.
No? Okay, I thought it cut out. Just keep it close.
Okay.
There you go. Pull it towards you. Make yourself comfortable. Well, what I want to say about the your vision at this point for bridging the gap between everyday people and academia or theologians, essentially, I love that. I hope it works because I think we need more of that. And when someone says they wrote a book or give me a book or whatever, look, a lot of times it's great, but my natural, my first thought is not like, okay, this is probably going to be the best book ever and I'll take a look at it maybe, or maybe I'll read it, maybe I won't.
Could be about their dog. Or
yeah, I mean, it's just, I think there's some books that probably didn't need to be written. Okay, we can probably all agree on that, right?
Most of them.
Yeah. So, just because someone has written a book doesn't mean it's a great book. So I did not. I already knew I wanted to have you on the podcast based on your experiences and your interests and your education and all of that. But I didn't go to the book first to read the book. But in preparing for tonight, I did click on the link and I did open the book, and I actually had a hard time stop reading.
That's good.
And I'm not just saying that. Like, I wouldn't say that.
Thanks, man.
But I opened the book and I started to read the introduction. It was very, you were writing as if we were talking. It was very easy to read, and I didn't want to stop reading. And so I didn't read the whole book in one sitting, but I did read chunks, and then I scanned a bunch more. And I did want to mention that to you. Like, once I started to read it, I didn't want to stop. But yeah, the one thing I also wanted to tell you was we met randomly at this coffee shop, and I feel like tonight is destined to happen, or it's fate or whatever, because that morning, this is very strange, but that morning I just had this weird sort of desire to put my old set of cowboy boots on and dress just a little bit Western. Yeah. And I never do that. I grew up with horses. I love horses. I would be a cowboy in a flash, but I don't walk around dressing Western. And never at a meeting at 7:30 a.m. with Darrell, For whatever reason, that morning I was just like, I feel like dressing a little Western. And that was what caused us to, it was something about my cowboy boots or the vest I was wearing or something.
Boots, and I think one of us looked over and was like, oh, that's a pair of boots.
Yeah.
This is probably a family-friendly podcast, so I'm not going to say what we called them, but they're kickers.
What'd you call them?
A certain kind of kickers.
What kicker? This is not a family-friendly podcast.
Shit kickers.
Oh, shit kickers? What's a shit kicker?
They're just boots that you can do anything in.
Oh, right?
Yeah. They're like you can muck out the stables. Yes. Like, they just look like a pair of boots you could just kind of go to work in.
They are. Yeah. That's exactly. So that caused us to have that little conversation, and we met each other, and now here we are. So I'm super excited about it.
Me too. Hey, I just want to thank you for opening the book, because, when you write a book, you give it to a bunch of people for their opinion. There's no guarantee that people are going to open the book.
Sure.
Sure. They're like, oh, yeah, sure. Cool.
Yep. But the way that you led into the book, the premise for the book, how you were making it relatable, I hope it does well for you.
Thanks, man.
Yeah, I hope it does well for you. And that's coming from a person who knows nothing about selling books. So, I mean, I don't, but I've read a lot.
And after talking to publishers, I think publishers are still trying to figure out how to sell books in this new, to them, like, they're like, okay, Instagram, you need to have, or you need to go be on TikTok. I think there's a lot of confusion from publishers of what's going to sell. Mm-hmm. And, everyone's risk averse. We all buy insurance of different kinds. And, I just think it's been one of the frustrations of talking to publishers so far. I have a great agent. Things are going well in general, but almost like connecting like what you have found by simply opening the book and a publisher who will read the pitch and then send it to their marketing department, and they barely even read the pitch. Never mind.
Sure.
Because people don't usually bring books to a publisher. They usually bring a pitch because they haven't written the book yet. Mm-hmm. So they're not used to being like, oh, this is like a thing already. Yep. Which can present its own problems, but that's not the main point. The main point is I think that risk aversion, especially with sales and marketing, they go, okay, no matter how good this book is, we want to see social media followers, and we want to see that this person is hooked up in certain networks, and we want to make sure that we don't have any other books that we're currently selling that are already like this book. And when you give a publisher a book that's how to read the Bible, even if it is a different approach, which I think you've already seen, it's a different approach than most books that you would be handed, they go, well, we already have a bunch of books in this space. Yeah. So I would just ask for your prayers that it finds the right home, because we're just trying to find a editor and a publisher that think the way that you think, that open up and go, oh, wow, this is actually like a pretty unique thing. So, but I appreciate it.
Well, just, again, I don't know much about this space at all, but one thing you mentioned and that I've heard a bunch of other times is the publishers now want you to have the platform. Mm-hmm. Essentially, they're just logistics and distribution, apparently.
Correct. And
you need to have the platform, drive the demand, et cetera, which, I don't want to, I guess that is what it is at this point. Yeah. But
there's a reason I was going to self-publish this originally.
Yeah. Well, are you not going to now?
We're thinking it's still an option on the table.
Okay.
But, when you get an agent like what I was able to get, this guy was responsible for bringing The Message to market and Crazy Love by Francis Chan. Like, this is a heavy hitter, big player dude, really great guy. He's been vouched for by a bunch of people I trust. So I value that relationship so much that I want to go through the process of, like, his name is Don, and he used to be the head of Nav Press, and before that, David C. Cook Publishing. And so I respect him so much that I want to go through the process of talking to publishers, even if they all don't get it, and we end up hitting the self-publish button anyway.
Yep.
Because his knowledge is so vast.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of trusting the people you're with.
Yeah. Well, the only thing I want to say on that is just, if it falls to you to build your own platform, then just make sure you stay true to yourself as you're attempting to go about doing that. Like someone with your education and experiences doesn't need to go out there and try to, be the next big TikToker. You know what I mean? That seems like
I'm never going on TikTok.
Yeah. It just seems like now, if you want to go on TikTok and be yourself, or on Instagram and be yourself, and that builds a following or a platform or whatever, drives demand, great. But you don't want to be going on the the social medias and portraying yourself in a way that's different to who you are and selling yourself short. I mean, one of the differentiators for a person like you is your wealth of education. So I mean, that and the work should speak for itself.
I was thinking of starting to do a series of pictures in which I sit in an ice cold bathtub every morning, but that space was already taken.
By who? By me?
Yeah.
I did not know. Okay, I didn't know where you're going with that.
No, was that not you? I thought I saw on my feed.
We do have a cattle trough out there filled with water, and right now it does have ice in it, and I do get in it. Yeah,
it's incredible. I have so many questions about that. I'll save it for later in the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to circle back around to it.
Yeah. Like, is there any chemical burn that happens in your extremities? Like, there's so much.
Yeah,
and like, kudos to your wife for also.
She gets in it too.
Oh my goodness,
we do it together. Yeah,
you guys must be like fit.
We try. Yeah. It feels good to be healthy.
Yeah. Wakes you up, I'm sure.
Wakes you up. I actually don't do it in the mornings. I do it in the evening. We have a sauna out there too. So we sit in the sauna for 20 minutes to an hour, 20 to 40 minutes usually, and then get in the cold bath for 3 to 4 minutes. And I actually don't know all the science behind it, but I do know it releases dopamine in your brain.
So you feel better afterwards.
You feel great. You feel
I know
better.
A lot of like professional athletes have started doing cryotherapy where they're going in these like really cold, really cold rooms essentially. So I'm sure there's some science behind it.
Exactly. So yeah, I think it's great. I do have a couple of buddies that are doing it first thing in the morning. I take 3 cold showers a day, first thing in the morning, after the gym, midday, and then at night again. And the cold shower in the morning, I started in June and it was pretty easy when it was June and 110 degrees outside, but now it's getting cold and it does wake you up. Wakes you up great. So I have to imagine getting in a ice tank first thing in the morning for 3 minutes would really set the day really well, but that doesn't really fit with my my daily habits or process, my rhythms. Yeah. So it's an evening thing. So I did it about 2 hours ago.
We've got those dudes who like the ex-Navy SEALs and the Tony Robbins of the world and everything, like the self-help guys who like, those guys swear by this kind of stuff for like years, like the cold plunge and all that.
Yes. Yep. 100%. I want to ask you this before we kind of get into spiritual formation. We met randomly. I didn't know you, and I don't think you knew me. And we're talking, and as it turns out, I'm the executive director of Emmanuel Nashville, and you preach occasionally at Church of the City. This is your church, and you teach there as well. And we're both in the same city. We never met. I don't think we knew each other existed, nope. and all that. That's fine. I don't know a lot of people in Nashville. But later I was thinking about this because we were sort of like locating our churches, like giving each other a little bit of information on kind of which, I guess, theological or cultural kind of streams.
It's like a shorthand
we're part of, right? And so I just remember we were talking about like just a little bit on kind of placing the churches, and I think it was mentioned, like Tim Keller, like in our kind of theological vein of church or whatever. I've read a couple of Keller books. I think our pastors read. We're kind of in that. He's at like kind of the headwaters of our movement, I guess you could maybe say. Yeah. And And you mentioned another guy. You mentioned someone who's kind of like the Tim Keller equivalent. John Tyson. So here's John Tyson kind of at the headwaters of your movement-ish.
Yeah, they know each other. They're both New York guys.
Okay.
They're both, Protestants in a certain vein of things.
Yep. But this is what stood out to me is that there's my guess is we probably at the end of the day agree or believe just like so many of the same things.
Yeah.
And yet we're both in the same city and our churches don't really interact.
Yeah.
Is this like it seems like something about Christianity, and maybe this exists in other religions too. I'm curious to know if it does, but it seems like there's like a lot of, or maybe countless, like cultural, theological, and relational silos.
Yeah, I think especially in the United States of America, because we're so
okay. So it is in
individuated.
particular in the United States of America, you think?
Mm-hmm.
So what's up with that? Is this just the way it needs to be?
Post-Protestant Reformation, post-printing press. So like church was not really like, there were only two kinds of, well, that's oversimplification. There were two major kinds of Christians before Martin Luther. And that was Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox. And then you had like some Egyptian Coptic Christians and a couple other like small, but like until 1500, you don't have this proliferation of things. And then with the advent of the printing press and the translation of scriptures into common languages, right? So people start to read the Bible for themselves. People start to learn how to read. It's not that the priest is kind of giving all the information anymore. And then the United States of America, which is this biggest experiment that's ever happened in terms of individualism, melting pot and cultures and silos. And, I'm from Boston, and there's still like a little Italy called the North End in Boston, right? And it's like mostly Italian people still live there, so we have all these silos. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely, and there's a big story about how Christianity spread in the United States as sort of, whatever you want to call it, conquest or manifest destiny, or the railroads or the wars with native peoples, like all of those things were happening. And there's kind of a jokey story that goes like, first you had the Baptists that would just walk, they would just go find people, the Baptists and the revivalists who would just go to the pioneer and just start a church. And they had no formal training. They were just they had a Bible, and then you had the Methodist circuit riders. They had horses because the Methodists were a little bit more organized. They were sort of off of Anglicanism. And then, all the way down the line, eventually you had the Episcopalians, and they would arrive, which were basically Anglicans. They would arrive when the train tracks got laid down, right? Because they had their books and they had their trunks and they had, they wanted a certain level.
This was the Episcopalians?
Yeah, because they were sort of the offspring of the Church of England, the Anglican churches. These were the educated elites, right? And so they're not going to come live on a pioneer town when there's no doctor or there's no like way to get their books, because they are educated. They went to Harvard, they went to Yale, they went to Princeton, all these schools that were originally opened as seminaries, for training in the 1700s. So you really do have this kind of dispersal of people across from east to west, just like you see people in the western half of the United States tend in general to be a little different than people on the East Coast. There's different vibes. There's more cowboys in one half than in the other. The counties are bigger. The things are more spread out. People, the kinds of people you run into are different on the frontier. And as the frontier became, the Appalachian Mountains, and then the next one, and the next one, the next one, and Oregon Trail and all that, you get this dispersal of people. It's really interesting. I was involved as a teenager. I was involved in Calvary Chapel, which is not a denomination, but it kind of is. But Calvary Chapel started in California with the Azusa Street Revival, Chuck Smith, all this stuff, Costa Mesa. So it's really interesting. The most kind of stodgy, old school, kind of calcified Calvary Chapels are actually on the West Coast. And the more kind of a little bit more new, a little bit more fresh ones are on the East Coast, because Calvary Chapel did the exact opposite of what the United States of America did. It spread west to east rather than east to west, which is what almost every other institution in the United States did. Yeah. So that's why like there's a New York kind of establishment, Boston establishment, sort of Philadelphia, that kind of old money, there's more roots. And then people who made their money in California, it's just younger money, right? Or it's younger culture, or it's like, it's just more melting pot, or, there were Mexicans who lived in Mexico. And then when we got California from Mexico, they were now in California. So there's just a different group of people. They didn't go anywhere, just the country kind of, ate them up in a way. So you've got all these dynamics. And so to come back to your question, I think there's just millions of different combinations of factors that would cause churches in the United States to silo. There could be two churches half a mile from each other that are almost exactly the same church, and they don't know that the other one exists because of all of these denominational splits. And Protestantism is a big part of this. We split when we disagree about carpet color or drums in church or whatever, and the political stuff and the cultural ethnic stuff and all that, especially in the South. The South was legally siloed, segregation for quite a while. So you have churches in historically black neighborhoods, churches in historically now Hispanic neighborhoods. So but all this layering of different stuff that could make a church that seems like the same as one down the street actually quite different. Or it's just that it ended up in a similar place, but they just took a way different path.
Yeah. It just stood out to me how that we can be in such similar churches in the same city.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know, I'm sorry, was it John Tyson?
Yeah, Tyson.
No,
yeah, and he's in
not
New
John,
York.
is it?
Yeah, it's John Tyson.
John.
So he's in New York.
Yeah.
But my pastor's Matt Smallbone.
Yep. Right. But my point is, like, I'm familiar with Tim Keller. Never heard of John Tyson.
Yeah.
And also, I don't know. I'm not participating in the mission of Church of the City. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you're not really participating in the mission of Emmanuel Nashville. Yeah, we are.
To your credit, though, John Tyson's a much smaller name than Tim Keller. Tim Keller's one of the 10 most recognizable evangelical names, period, probably, right?
Okay. Yep.
Right? He's probably like the C.S. Lewis-ish of our time, I would say.
Yeah. That could be. It just, as someone who considers himself still like a young man, it just was like, this is interesting. I wonder why this is. I wonder if it has to be this way. Because the truth is, like, I know what we're doing at Emmanuel, and I know what we're on mission about at Emmanuel and everything like that. I have no clue what the mission of Church of the City is. I don't know what you guys are working towards right now. My guess is we're probably all pulling in exactly the same direction, but we're not really joining forces.
I think that's the interesting point. I think that last part is the interesting point because, people don't know about each other, and there could be a shoemaker on the south side of town and a shoemaker on the north side of town, and they never bumped into each other, and they make shoes in a similar way. But since we as Christians believe there is a mission, like a big one, like capital M mission, like there is a great commission, it is interesting that as Protestants, sometimes we don't do a great job at intentionally networking among churches.
Right.
Because, and I think this is where I will bring some of my nerd bona fides to the table. I think in the 20th century, one of the things that evangelical Christians did is we borrowed corporate business models as a way of doing church. And so in borrowing those corporate business models, there were some really great things about that, growth and marketing and all this stuff, but there are also some drawbacks. When you, as a group of people who are like, we follow a 2,000-year-old Jewish guy whose blood we drink, and so that's weird. Yep. And when you try to domesticate that into sort of like a Starbucks brand, there's gonna be some interesting things that happen. You get mega churches and celebrity pastors and things that happen that maybe are not very Jesus-y or Christ-like. You also sometimes, I think, you get a spirit of, I don't have a better word than competitiveness, competition, like almost like, what we got to get our market share, and not that you even have to think that out loud. It's almost like an unspoken, like, well, if we want to exist, we need to put something out there that people. So there is a consumer nature. Like the Catholic Church is much worse at doing consumery things than we are, and there's some good things about that and some bad things about that. In the Eastern Orthodox Church and other sort of more stodgy, traditional kind of. But, it's interesting. The Catholic Church reminds you a lot, in certain ways, of Rome. And Presbyterians, old school Presbyterians, remind you a lot of Scotland in the 15 and 1600s, right? Every church has a cultural genesis, has a culture out of which it sprang, and it carries some of that characteristic with it. So churches that are new churches, like Emmanuel probably didn't exist 100 years ago.
That's true.
And neither did Church of the City. Well, what cultural characteristics are going to take on the late 20th into early 21st century? Like technology, business culture, growth mindset, reaching people in a diverse population, utilizing certain tools and, I said technology already, but you see what I'm saying? Like, it's going to feel like the culture out of which it was birthed. If you go to a church in where the Messiah live, in the highlands of Africa, their churches aren't going to remind us a lot of our churches at all, because the culture, they herd cattle, they drink their blood and milk, they are Christians, there are Maasai Christians, but they just wouldn't do church anything like what we do church. So I think this is a long way of me saying I think it makes sense that in a very kind of fractured marketplace where there's a bunch of different guys trying to sell you sports drinks, and there's a bunch of different people trying to sell you makeup, and there's a bunch of, there's going to be a bunch of different Christians on their mission trying to, selling is the wrong word, but trying to promote a certain brand of Christianity, and they might be really similar to each other and just not know that each other exists.
Yes, that makes sense. Yeah, and I don't know that, I'm not saying that this is definitively wrong. Maybe it's just the way it is, or the way it needs to be, or whatever, but I do know is like, as we're putting the schedule together at Emmanuel, the one thing that we're not talking about is how our schedule overlaps with Church of the City and Crosspoint and all these other churches in Nashville. You know what I mean? Like
there's no coordination.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And I think I know why it is because like, well, it's hard enough just to manage your own schedule and manage your own mission, and you know what I mean? And without kind of coordinating that with everyone else's. But as maybe maybe from the standpoint of an idealist, like maybe this is just something that doesn't happen entirely until the new earth or whatever, where we can all like be coordinated. Yeah. You know, like, is that too much do you think that'll ever change?
I think you get certain things with coordination, like a large denominational structure. Like there's no Methodist church that's just doing whatever it wants. There's no PC USA Church or PCA Church or UCC Church or Roman Catholic Church or Eastern Orthodox Church just going cowboy, right? This is our particular issue within American evangelical / non-denominational.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
So it's a particular issue for us. Now, we have a lot of advantages. We can be nimble, and we can respond to cultural kind of goings on, and we can really relate to people. And people that come to my church, I meet people all the time that are like, this is my first week. And it's new, and it can be fresh, and you can challenge, and you can do things that a big, huge Titanic style ship maybe can't do. But I think you put your finger on the pulse. One of the great drawbacks of all this is a lack of coordination, communication. And I think so. I'm going to be an optimist for a minute, and this is going to get a little kooky. I think if we believe in the Holy Spirit, maybe there is some kind of coordination. It's just not maybe not as like intentional as we might want it to be.
Yeah, maybe it's not as programmed. Maybe the programming doesn't come entirely from us.
I think it's possible. Like, what if there's a person out there that needed to go to Church of the City for a few weeks? They landed in Nashville. Their friend told them about it. They got kind of what we call fed, right? They got some good teaching and made some connections. And then their friend that they get close to, they become roommates with, invites them to Emmanuel, but that becomes their home church. I don't think that's a bad story.
Yeah, I agree.
Right? Like, and I'm sure there's dozens of permutations, hundreds of permutations of that among the different churches. We have a lot of people that come to our church that went to, what's the TV church?
Crosspoint?
Crosspoint. .tv, right? Like that they go to Crosspoint and it's fine, but they're looking for something maybe a little bit different.
Sure.
And then they come to our church, and I hope Crosspoint, the people at Crosspoint, are happy that they found a community and a place where Jesus is being followed and God is being worshipped, and hopefully that is the kind of sort of non-coordinated coordination.
Yes.
That now I'm not saying that's as good as it can be.
Yep.
I think there's definitely growth. And I would say another thing that Protestants, especially American Protestants, something that kind of quietly coordinates kind of in the background are these parachurch, like Passion, or these worship conventions. She Reads Truth, publishers and podcasts, and, Carlos Whitaker, AF Downs, all these people running around Nashville. They're kind of doing their own thing. But it's almost like this connective tissue in a way that their audiences go to dozens of different churches, and I think that's a good thing.
Yes.
Now, once again, I'm not pretending it's the best version that it could possibly be, but I think we do have a lot of these almost like entrepreneurial connective tissue. Now, it's not under the control of the local church, so sometimes that can be super frustrating, and it's not even under the influence necessarily of the local church, unless you've got like let's say my book sold. Let's say like 100,000 people read my book, and people are like, this guy's a person. I still submit to my leadership at my church. Like if they had a problem Like if Matt Smallbone came up to me and was like, hey, this is like he actually did with an earlier version of the book there. He was like, look, I know you're being yourself. I know you're being a little bit more edgy than the normal Bible guy, but like this phrase you're using might turn some people off. Mm-hmm. And I took that and I didn't like it because I was like, I'm not being myself. Like, yep. But then I was like, you know what? If like a little old lady in North Carolina would read the book if this phrase isn't in it and not read the book if it's not, then it's like, can I lose the phrase?
Yep.
The phrase was, what the hell?
Matt Smallbone.
But he was just like, because he was like, man, I could see churches using this as curriculum.
Sure.
And some pastors might read, and like it was the opening story where I'm sitting in the back of the room and the guy's preaching on a completely crazy topic.
Yeah. Yes, I read
and the phrase
story.
that was in my head was like, what the hell is this guy talking about?
Yes.
And so I just kind of muted it.
Yeah.
And like, is that selling out? I don't know. like.
Well, oh man, we might have to have a whole other podcast to talk about that because I have some of those same questions. But this to wrap up this thought, it does seem to me that sometimes modern Protestant evangelicalism, whatever we should call it now.
That's good, I think.
Okay. Forgets how different they are from other religions and focuses on the small differences amongst its own religion. Yeah. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, like as a teenager, I was going to a Calvary Chapel, a mega church, like 18,000 people in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And the implication, this was never said out loud, but the implication is like, we're the ones who figured it out.
Yes.
Like we've got the right everything. And so people would quote unquote get saved. They would come up, they would say a sinner's prayer. There would be this whole thing. And they would say, we don't care if you go to our church. We just want you to find a Bible believing church in South Florida. But all the kind of nonverbals where we are the Bible, like we are the way kind of a thing. And so that siloing can almost become like a tribalism.
Yes.
And I think that's something that should continue to be intentionally, my Catholic friends, because I went to a Catholic seminary for 3 years. One of my Catholic friends, one of the advantages they have over us is when there's a disagreement on interpretation of Scripture, like they can always say, well, the church decides, like the Pope, the cardinals, the councils, the Second Vatican Council, all these, like we have mechanisms for adjudicating proper doctrine, practice, things of that nature. That's why we have this stance over here, this stance over there. Protestants don't have that. So that's why we all disagree about everything all the time, why we have so many denominations, why we have so silos.
Okay, that makes sense.
And I was challenged by that, but here's my idea. My idea is that much like the early church where you had the churches in Antioch or Ephesus or Rome or Jerusalem, and you had different leaders, and Paul got into arguments with people, right? Paul was like, no, I don't like what that guy's saying. And James was highlighting different things in his letter than Paul does in some of his letters. Like in some of Paul's letters, it's like grace, 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 grace. And in James, he's like faith and works go together, right? Like, so there's some tensions, right? This is a exploding world religion that is happening before their very eyes. But there was a community of communities, and that's what I think. I think the roots of that are there for Protestant evangelicals, but I think we could cultivate it. I think, and there is a World Council of Churches, but that tends to be super progressive and like kind of syncretist, meaning kind of a little sellouty when it comes to the gospel. And I think this is what the organizations like the Gospel Coalition and Acts 29 and others have tried to do, is create some kind of sense of, let's send some leaders to go discuss these things. And we don't have to agree. We don't have to come down with the same doctrinal statement at the end of the day. This is not to try to even get on the same page. It's just to be in conversation with one another. I think that's happening, but I think it could happen more.
Yeah.
To your point.
The thing that you mentioned about everyone tends to believe that they know the way and they're doing it right. I want to just reinforce that and also just mention that because I was raised very much that way. I was raised Mennonite, and we sort of knew the truth, and we kind of had it figured out, and this is the way, and but also, like, if you leave, it's dangerous, and maybe not every sect has that. If you leave, it's dangerous, but also they do. It might go on. It goes unspoken.
That's an important word. Sect is a technical word that I was going to bring it up, so I'm glad you did. A sect is a part of a religion that believes that they are literally the only ones who have really figured it out.
See, that's scary to me.
Mm-hmm.
That's scary to me
Yeah.
because I'm not trying to make a point because also, look, I have family and still great friends that are still in that particular sect of Christianity, and they're born again believers, and we're going to see each other on the new heavens, new earth, and whatever.
Which means you're not part of a sect. You saying that means you're not part of a sect because you're saying, hey, look, I can identify that you and I have some differences, some real differences, but I still think you're part of the family of God. You're still a follower of Jesus. So a sect, and the reason I'm kind of hammering this is because you're making some really important points, is that a sect, at least officially, says if you're outside of this, you're not really you're not really good. You're not really, like you're kind of dangerous.
Okay, so the thing I just wanted to say on that was, if you're hearing amongst your people, your tribe, your echo chamber, I don't mean that in an entirely negative way, that you guys have found the right way and you're doing it the right way, just because you're hearing that doesn't necessarily mean it's true.
Correct.
Because they're all saying it. We're all saying it.
And I would
I didn't that would have been helpful information for me 20 years ago.
And I would actually say the people saying that the loudest are probably the least likely to be right. So the people who are shouting, I'm the only one who's right, that's the person I actually trust the least. The person who's saying, hey, I might have some things wrong. Like we see it in the Bible, like Jesus talks about, the Pharisee who's like, God, I thank you. You didn't make me like this sinner over here, and that I pray and I tithe and I do all the right things. And then there's this sinner tax collector guy who's like, hey, just have mercy on me, God, because like what heart does Jesus highlight as like the right one? It's not the person who says, I literally have everything figured out. It's the one who says, I probably have a lot of things that I don't have figured out. So.
Ooh, I never thought of it like that before. That's actually a little bit scary, but I'm trying to think just real quickly, like if I agree or disagree with that premise, and I think I agree with it because I think it sort of checks out. So
the nerdy phrase is epistemological humility. And what epistemological humility means is I might be wrong. So like if someone's like, do you know that, pick a doctrine, whatever. Do you know that Jesus went down to hell and released how did that work? I'm like, I don't know. Like I have a little, what are angels? I don't know how angels work. I don't have enough. Like if someone's like, hey, if you take this antibiotic, will it probably clear up your sinus infection? I'll be like, I think so. But like my son is so funny, my 6-year-old, because a lot of the time he'll be like, well, are you sure? And I'm like, no.
Right.
Like I thought I was going to get here an hour before I did tonight. I was like, my GPS, I had a computer who told me, you will get here at 6:53, and I strolled in at 7:53 because there was a Thursday night football game that I didn't know about. So it's simply, it's not saying I don't believe anything, and it's not saying like I don't firmly stand on things like Scripture or Jesus or anything. It's just being like, hey, my interpretation could be wrong.
Yes,
because there's hundreds of them. Like maybe your Mennonite folks are right. I don't know. Like I don't think so, or I would become a Mennonite.
Right.
Yep. But like I don't think they're idiots. You know what I'm saying? Or my Roman Catholic friends, like they have a very different way of doing church. I went to mass with them when I lived in Boston. The Mary thing has always been interesting to me. Papal authority, all that stuff. I have some very serious disagreements with some of my Roman Catholic friends, but the ones who C.S. Lewis talked about this, the ones in his book Mere Christianity, he talked about it like a hallway. He said, mere Christianity, what I'm boiling down Christianity to, whether you're Catholic, whether you're Protestant, whether you're whatever, is like a hallway. It's a hallway we can all kind of come out of our rooms. Imagine like a long, dark hallway in like a mansion. We can all come out of our rooms. Everything's like made with nice wood, like this table we're sitting at. And people come out of their rooms and we can shake hands and have a drink and talk to each other and exchange ideas. But then he says, it's not a good place to live because it's not a home. You need a home. Everyone needs to go back into their room where there's a fireplace. There's some nice leather chairs. It's comfy. It's cozy. You can have friends. You can't live in the Venn diagram overlap between 100 different churches. You can't live there. You got to live somewhere. So you got to be Mennonite, or you got to be Baptist, or you got to be at Emmanuel, or you got to be at Church of the City downtown. But I think it's nice to come out into the hallway because you go, oh, these people, we don't do infant baptism. We do infant dedication, but they do infant baptism. That's really interesting. Like my brother-in-law, my brother-in-law, Nick, and my sister-in-law, Sarah, they go to Midtown Fellowship Creve Hall. That's a PCA church. So it's a little bit more conservative, on the conservative half of Presbyterianism. They baptize infants. That my nephew Jack is baptized. Our kids were dedicated, right? And we can have the whole theological discussion. And back in the day, R.C. Sproul and John Piper went back and forth about this whole thing because John Piper was part of these Reformed Baptists that would baptize adults, right? Like, so that was different than some of the Reformed Presbyterians who would baptize children. This sounds very boring, but it comes out in real life. Yep. Like when a couple has a baby and they go, hey, what should we do with this baby? Should we baptize the baby and then that baby's a Christian?
Right.
Or should we dedicate this baby and we're welcoming God to kind of eventually welcome this person fully into the family of God in such a way that they would choose to become baptized, right? Like it's two pretty different ways of raising your kids.
Yep. But the problem with coming out of your rooms into the hallway is someone who is in your room might choose to go back into someone else's room. You know what I mean? They might choose another room. And so if you're an authority or power or whatever of one of the rooms, you want to keep people in the room. You have a vested interest in keeping them in the room. Don't let them go out in the hallway because they might choose another room. Yeah. And there's something about certainty that feels good. I think certainty appeals to the human nature.
It's reassuring.
It is. It is reassuring. But it also makes sense on the other side of it, which is there's a lot of motivation for certainty, because if you can tell people what the definite truth is and there's no other way and you're certain about it, then they don't need to ask questions because it's so clear. Yep. This is the way it is. We're certain about this. Yep. You don't have to go in the hallway to ask questions. You don't have to ask questions because we know this is true.
Yeah, it's all here.
It's all here. We got it. So I think that...
and by the way, that's a very modernist way of thinking.
The certainty is?
Yeah, the certainty. So just a really quick thing. So traditional ways of thinking, they thought about things, different cultures thought about things differently, but basically there was like an embodied kind of like, your dad's a blacksmith, you're probably gonna be a blacksmith. Like, right? Like there's these things you just do with your body. Like Catholicism is very embodied. A lot of other religions had a lot to do with bodies, and they were very kind of organic in their thinking. They thought in terms of circles and wheels and the sun and trees. I mean, read the Psalms, right? Psalms are full of nature imagery and all this stuff. There's a certain way of thinking about it it's not proving a point to you necessarily. That kind of thinking came along with the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution and what we call modernism. And I talk about this in my book. From about 1650 to about 1950, you get this thing called modernism. And we still are living in the kind of vestiges of modernism, which is, I need to prove to you the exact right answer. Like, we need to know this for sure. Like, it's called machine thinking, right? It's like why classrooms and schools are their factories, which doesn't always help all the kids. Like, my kid doesn't do well in certain behavioral aspects of school because we're still working off the British Empire model of like factory. We are producing like a factory produces pencils or cars. We're producing students, right? So this kind of machine thinking was the dominant form of thinking in Europe and North America for the last several hundred years. Like, our grandparents had this machine thinking. Our great-grandparents certainly did, depending on how city or agrarian, how urban or agrarian you are. But basically, it's about, I need to get the exact right answer to this math problem. 4 plus 4 is 8. There's no other answer, right? And so then World War II happened, and the Holocaust happened, and nuclear weapons happened, and everyone went, and by everyone, I mean intellectuals, academics went, oh no. The French thought they were right, and the Germans thought they were right, and the English thought they were right, and the Japanese thought they were right, and the Americans thought they were right, and the Russians thought they were right, and they all had all their formulas to prove they were right, and all their dictums and their sayings and all their little I don't agree with him on everything, but what Rob Bell famously called brickianity in Velvet Elvis many years ago, which is, we're going to build our little brick walls using our little thoughts and using our little, everything's a formula and everything's a machine, and we're going to prove to you exactly what the right answer is to every single question, right? That's where you get modern apologetics, where it's like, I'm going to prove that God's real. Like, good luck. Good luck proving that God is real to someone who doesn't believe in God. Usually those debates become kind of self-insulated. But basically, modernism was this movement, and guess what? It did a lot of great things. Modern medicine. We're super happy that we have that just women don't just die in childbirth all the time anymore, right? Transportation, electricity, as the kids say, they have the receipts, right? Modernism has the receipts. They have the proof that there was something there. They created nuclear power plants and, just like the ability to fly like anywhere in the world. Like there are all these amazing things that modernism did. And so it was so triumphant and it was so powerful. But World War II showed all its cracks and all its faults and flaws. And so the answer to this, the retort, the argument back against it is called postmodernism. And some people are very afraid of postmodernism. Some people are very comfortable with it. Postmodernism at its best is a critique of modernism that says, no, you're not as right as you think you are. You shouldn't be as sure as you are. You should be honest about your biases. You're pretending like you're a logic machine, but really you're a human being with flesh and blood, that you walk around, you speak a certain language, you're male or female, you grew up in a certain family. You have all these limitations given that you're a human. You're not a computer, right? And so postmodernism in its healthiest form is simply critiquing that overconfidence that you were talking about of the person in the room saying, we have every single answer. We have every single right thing. And so Christianity, as we talked about before, especially Protestant Christianity, tends to take on the cultural forms in which it emerges. And so the big box evangelical megachurch, big screens, good, nice speakers, sound systems, everything, is like strategies and church planning conferences and all this stuff. This is all a very modern apparatus. It's a very machine. It's a machine. And I'm not saying that is a bad thing. There are pluses and minuses to it. Just like I like that I drove here in a car today. I'm glad I didn't try to walk. But
I gotten here quicker.
Yeah, in this particular night. But postmodernism, I think, offers a helpful corrective, and it's not somewhere you want to live, because postmodernism, when pushed to its extreme, is like nobody can know anything, and you do your thing and I do mine, and who even knows, right? And there's like no truth claims at all, and it's just sort of like meaningless babble. But in its healthiest form, it goes, hey guys, what if you're not a machine? What if you don't think perfectly? What if you get some things wrong? And what if you could actually know more by admitting what you don't know? And that is the epistemological humility piece that I think that the best forms of postmodernism introduce to modernism and say, hey, what if you're not seeing certain things? What if you're getting some things wrong? So that's kind of my answer to your question of, I think, the kind of modernist, and I'll just bust the can wide open. Here we go. The modernist weakness in church is not just the commercialized consumer factory business model, but also the top-down authoritarian. Let me keep you in this room. Let me tell you, you have everything you need here. Please don't go out in the hallway. Don't go out in the hallway. So that's the weakness. And so let's call it the weakness of the CEO. The weakness of a lot of these churches that you and I have probably bumped into, not Mennonite churches, because they're working off a several hundred-year-old model, but the ones we're talking about are working off the weaknesses of a CEO model. Like he's a great businessman, so he'll be a great pastor or a great president or whatever it is. Well, the churches that I'm seeing emerge now, and obviously a lot of churches are dying in the United States of America. A lot of young people are opting out. But some of the problems that I see emerging in younger churches, even in my own church, we're not so much operating totally on that modernist business machine, CEO, marketing, big box principle anymore. But the language and the feel, and I want to say this so super carefully because I think this is so valuable. I think therapy is super valuable. I think psychiatrists and psychologists and therapists, have a lot of friends who do that work. It's incredible work. But what I'm starting to see, as much as like for much of the 20th century, Protestants borrowed commercial language and CEO language and marketing language, machine language, I'm seeing therapeutic language start to dominate some of the circles that I'm starting to sound like an old man. But it's almost like one of my questions, and I'd love to write a book about this someday, is there anything therapy can't do? Like, is there any role for the church? And that's me being a little bit dramatic, right? What is the role of the church in a world where church increasingly, our language is therapeutic, our books are therapeutic, our pastors are therapeutic, we're pro-therapy, which I think in general is more healthy than like my parents' generation, where if you were going to therapy, it's because you were nuts.
Right. Crazy. Yep.
Yeah, you're crazy. So love therapy. I'm for it. But just like I think there were a lot of good things about that modern commercial CEO marketing modernist model, I think this more therapeutic, I don't want to say touchy-feely because that makes me feel like, it makes me sound like I hate it, which I don't. This more therapeutic model of church. I think there's going to be great things that come of it. Emotionally healthy spirituality is a class that like we do. Pete Scazzaro wrote the book on it. We do it at our church. I'm for it. I think it's great. I think it's healthy. But I think any model you use to do church with, there will be some downsides and there will be some excesses. So that's just my 2 cents.
Okay, so do you think that, because this is not something that I've heard before or that I've thought of, do you think we're potentially exiting this business wave in church and entering a therapeutics therapy sort of a wave?
I think it's hard to completely discharge previous kind of models. Like you're gonna hang on to what works, right? So it's like, I know a lot of people who are involved in house churches and home church planning and stuff like that. Those things, they're fine. I don't have anything against them. Excuse me. But they tend to lack the cultural capital that like more like big box churches do. Like even if it's 200 people in a big box church or 300 people or 1,000 people or whatever. So I don't think you're not ever, but in the next few hundred years, I don't think you're going to see people completely abandon big box, top down, CEO. But I think it's going to move away from some of, hopefully, God willing, it moves away from some of the excesses of those things, right? Of like the dominating dude leader who tells everybody that he knows God's, the whole Mars Hill and all that stuff. And 100 other stories we could tell about failed leadership and all that. I think those old school dudes probably need a bit of therapy, in general in their language. But I'm always wary of like swinging the pendulum, right? Of just being like, okay, now we only meet on like people's couches and living rooms and we only talk about our feelings and there's no such thing as sin, right? I'm always kind of looking down the road and saying, okay, I think I know postmodernism is a good corrective to modernism. I know that the therapeutic kind of emotionally healthy Christianity is a good corrective to like the macho, top down, do what I say, stay in the room kind of a thing. Who do you think you are? That whole thing. But I think in the same way that you can always swing, right? And so in Boston, I went to Boston College, which was Catholic, and then I went to a Presbyterian church on the weekends. That was the church we were involved with, City Life Presbyterian PCA church. And it was so funny to see how much the PCA church in certain ways was just a direct reaction to Catholicism, right? Because that's what it was. It was a reaction in the Reformation to Catholicism. And you can see, you're like, oh, you're doing this thing because it's just not that thing, right? Like, yeah, you have your reasons and you think that way of doing things. But it's just kind of funny. I don't know if you've ever been talking to your child or a young person or like a teenager where they're like, I'm literally going to do the opposite of what you say just because you said it and I don't like that. Yeah. Right. So sometimes I think cultural or church trends can be that same way where it's like, oh, all those churches were big box. Let's only have living room churches, or let's and I love small groups. I'm a huge fan of small groups, but I think I've said enough about that. I think I'm just babbling at this point.
You mentioned something just real quick that I wanted to touch back on because I didn't understand it. Is that I think you said that Catholicism can be even more consumeristic than Protestants? How so? Because I would have thought it's the other way.
No, I probably just misspoke. Okay. Yeah. No, I think the most consumeristic churches are the ones that are most hooked into American culture.
That's what I would have thought.
Yeah. Okay. So the ones that are most like, name it, claim it, or Joel Osteen or whatever, the stuff that's just like on TV, the stuff that's going to be on TV, the stuff that's going to be on the radio, that's going to be the stuff that's most open to being co-opted.
Yes.
But what I did say a long time ago in the conversation, because I've said so much, is that the Catholic Church came out of a culture, and it came out of a Roman culture. So there are certain aspects, if you go to a Catholic church, that feel Roman, like the art or like the robes. Like they don't feel like they came from the 1700s. But then if you go to certain Presbyterian churches, it's like they feel like they came out of the 1600s, and like they feel of their time still, even though they've changed and molded and grown and all this stuff. And I would just say, like any church that started in the last 50 years or 30 years, let's say, their pastor is probably on social media, right? Like probably on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or something. And that's just an expression of the culture. How do you reach people? You reach people using the language and the tools that they have.
Yeah.
So, anyway,
I want to ask you about how certainty then ties in with formation, in particular spiritual formation, because this is one of the things that I definitely want to dig into with you. And I believe in your book you were kind of pointing out the kind of the three categories maybe of spiritual formation: word, sacrament, and community. Is that somewhat accurate?
Yeah, so word, sacrament, and community for me are the three ways that we encounter Jesus.
Okay, got it.
That's the start of people's journeys with Jesus. Either you hear the Bible preached, or you meet a Christian, or there is an embodied, the sacrament being like a baptism, or you go to a wedding. I've had people go to weddings and be like, man, that was a picture of something. Like that stirred something, right?
Yep. So word, sacrament, and community being three ways you can be introduced to Jesus, which makes sense. But I'd like you to get into spiritual formation just a little bit, and I'm even curious to know how then how can you do spiritual formation without falling back into certainty, which we were just talking about. But the way into that is I would like for you to talk about this question, which I heard you talking about on another podcast. And the question is very short and simple. And the question is, does my son know you? And I believe that is...
You're going to try to get me to cry on this podcast right now.
I think that's an okay into formation. Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong. But can you talk about, where that question comes from? And
there's a guy named... Yeah, I think remembering people who have died is a good thing, especially if they did something worthy of remembering. So there's a guy named Jonathan Tjarks, and he was he was a basketball writer for TheRinger.com, and he had written about the Dallas Mavericks before that. And he was a guy who became a Christian in his 20s, had no religious upbringing, really. And his father had died when he was young. And over time, all of his father's friends just weren't a part of his life anymore as the son that got left behind. And so one of his things was when he and his wife were pregnant, he started thinking, and he had gotten a pretty early in life cancer diagnosis. So he was they were pregnant, and he was also starting to deal with these health issues. His big question was, are these people going to stick around when I'm gone? And he did, after a few years, end up dying of cancer. And his big question for people was, does my son know you? But that's the question he's going to ask people in heaven, which gets me, because it's like, did you do what you said you were going to do? Like, did you show up? You called yourself my community. You called myself your friends. I can't raise my son anymore. I don't get to be here with him anymore. But did you step up? And I think that kind of embodiment, that community, that's one of the ways that people meet Jesus is this guy was a regular college student and went out and partied and blah, blah, blah. And then he just had a friend who was a Christian, and his friend was there's something different about his friend. And he didn't even start going to church. He started going to his friend's life group, which is like community group, small group, whatever, core group, whatever you want to call it. And so this non-Christian dude, and he was like 6'7", like big dude, would just come to this community group and just sit there and just experience it. And that is the body of Christ, right? That is bumping into Jesus. And obviously people are opening up their Bible, so you're hearing the word. And even though prayer is not a sacrament, technically, the only sacraments Protestants believe in are baptism and the Lord's Supper or communion, but Catholics believe in 7, including marriage and anointing the sick. And anyway,
we had 7.
What?
We had 7.
Yeah. Was it anointing the sick and last rites?
Marriage.
Marriage is a sacrament.
I don't know what they all were, but maybe they were similar to the Catholics.
Yeah. They might have just ported that over. So anyway, the actions that people do with their bodies are, maybe they're not sacraments, but they're embodiments of a relationship with Jesus. So this guy sat in a living room week after week, hearing people talk about the Bible, read the Bible, study the Bible, seeing people pray for each other, literally having people hug him and shake his hand. And he just became a Christian over time. He was like, this is just a better way to live. And then he started going to church and all that other stuff. And so he, when he got his cancer diagnosis, it was pretty bad. It was pretty a rare, like no one gets this. So he wrote this piece, Does My Son Know You? And The Ringer, which is not a Christian thing at all.
Oh, he wrote a piece on it.
Yeah, it's called Does My Son Know You?
I thought this was okay, got it.
It's the most read piece in the history of theringer.com, which is like a really successful pop culture website, sports website. And it's like the most read, most commented on.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
so it's out there. It's like it exists right now.
He wrote out of this experience of being like, starts talking about chemo. He's like, chemo's boring. You sit in a room and you don't have anything to do. And, so he talks about being sick and he talks about his faith. And like they published this thing. Like this is not a Christian publication.
Yeah.
And it's like you could hear the people on podcasts, tribute podcasts, the week after he died, because The Ringer has a huge podcast network, just kind of like talking about him and almost being like, why was he so different? Like, why did he live his life so differently? And they'd be like, well, there's his faith, because he was very open about it. He just thought Christianity was true. So, but it was almost like the people, because we live in such, on the coasts, I hate the phrase coastal elite, but coastal elites, very educated, very secular, humanist type people, they don't really bump into a ton of evangelicals, especially ones that aren't like screaming at them and holding signs or like doing something embarrassing or being hypocrites. So they just run into this guy that they work with for years and they just love him and they just think that he's this great guy and he's living his life according to these rhythms, right, of spiritual formation that we're talking about and word and sacrament and community. And they're almost like having to explain to themselves why they're not becoming Christians. Like you can hear it on the podcast. They're almost like, yeah, well, we all know he was a man of faith. Yeah. And he was like the best guy I ever knew. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I texted two guys in the last month. My dad died when I was 10 from cancer. And I texted two guys in the last month that I don't think I'd ever really told them before, like, hey, just so you guys know, in that season, from, I don't know, 10 to 15, 10 to 14, 11 to 14, you guys were actually really beneficial. They were other dads or husbands, whatever. I just had involvement with them through helping them out with whatever the thing is I was helping them out with. Essentially, I was working for them. But being around those guys formed me.
Yeah.
It just by nature of being around.
Yeah. It's
so I just thought when I heard that, like, does my son know you? It's kind of like catchy. Like you can remember that.
Yeah.
And I like that. I like that a lot. Like,
isn't that what you would ask someone, like if like you and I got hit by a bus tomorrow and then like you're in heaven and your buddies 100%. You'd be like, hey,
100%. Like if I go now and some of my best friends, wind up there, after, but my kids have another 50 years left or whatever. Yeah, I'd never thought of it that way. Yeah. But I would like to ask them, like, do my sons know you?
Yeah, did they grow up with you? Were you around?
Yeah, I would like for them to have.
So I'm pretty hardcore. Like I, from time to time, because I think about death. I'm an ethicist, so I think about awful things all the time. So I look at my we call them the front porch guys. We meet on one of our friends' front porches every Wednesday night, except for, if it's 1 degree out. We meet and we smoke cigars, and some of us drink whiskey. And we talk about our lives, and sometimes we pray, and sometimes we talk about the Bible. Sometimes we'll read a book, but most of the time it's just sharing life together. Mm-hmm. And I say every few months, I look at them, I'm like, hey, if I die, and I use strong language, I'm like, you dudes, you better show up for my kids. Like, this is what this is. Like, you're it. There's no other cavalry coming to like be part of my kids' lives. Like, you are the guys. And they all said, and everyone reaffirms that. And it's like, I'm the only one with young kids. There's some of the guys who are older who have older kids, and some of the guys don't have kids. But I'm the one who's like, guys, like, if I peace out for some reason outside of my control, and my kids are 7 and 4, you're it.
Yep. Well, if it happens, or to anyone who's listening, it doesn't take much. I know it takes a lot of energy, but all we're talking about is, bringing them fishing with you sometimes.
Show up to a sporting event.
Exactly. It's just the everyday stuff occasionally, not every day, but that stuff like that, it does actually make a difference.
And another thing, just on that note, is when I left tonight to go do this podcast, said, hey guys, I love you. Listen to your mom. I'll see you in the morning. But when I leave for Wednesday nights, I always say, hey guys, Daddy's going to hang out with his friends. Because I want my kids, when they're 13, 14, 15 years old, whatever happens, to be like, my dad has friends. Like my dad, like,
oh, that's cool. I like that.
my dad has friends. Like,
Yeah.
do you know how many middle-aged guys don't have any friends? Like, just don't have any friends. Like,
Yeah, a
there's
lot.
like a death of friendship in our culture because of all the things, right? Because of COVID and technology and joblessness and geographic moving, all that stuff, migration. But it's like, I say on purpose to my little dudes, I'm like, hey, I'm going to hang out with my friends. That is what I'm going to do. Because like, I want them to think, oh, I'd like to have friends.
Yep.
Because that's a huge
I
part
love
of
that.
spiritual formation to me is friendship.
Okay, so what are we talking about specifically? We can say spiritual formation. It's sort of easy to kind of bounce along the top of that, you know. But
You want my definition?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's like discipleship. So discipleship is the following of Jesus, right? Trying to do, I'll use Bonhoeffer words. So sorry to bring in Bonhoeffer for those of you who aren't familiar, but he's who I did my PhD dissertation on in my first book. So Bonhoeffer said in the first half of his book called Nachfolge, which means discipleship, it means following after. In the first half of his book, he says, Jesus asks us a question, and this is the question. Or here's the question we ask about Jesus. What does Jesus Christ want from us today? So that's his first question. What does Jesus want from us? That's a discipleship question. What rhythms, what scripture, what habits, what am I trying to do as I follow Jesus? Like, especially in the Gospels, as I'm following Jesus. Okay, what does Jesus want from me? That's a me-focused question. The second half of the book, discipleship, which some people might have a copy that says cost of discipleship. That was the original.
I've heard of that one.
English translation was called the cost of discipleship. The second half of the book, he turns the question on its head. And he says, who is Jesus Christ for us today? So it's the same relationship. Just the first half of the book is about how are we trying to follow Jesus, be like Jesus, imitate Jesus. But then as he deepens the ideas and the thoughts, and he brings in the concepts of the body of Christ and of communion and of baptism, he brings in this word sacrament stuff, and he marries it all. He starts to say, actually, discipleship is the first move where we hear the call of Jesus when we try to follow him. But there's this deepening called Gleichgestaltung, which just means conformation. It means being formed according to something. And he starts using words like we're formed according to the image of Jesus. We're formed according to the form of Jesus, like a statue, like the model of Jesus, right? And that is a work that Jesus is doing for us. It's not just the first half where we're trying really hard to be like Jesus. It's actually, ironically, something that God is doing within us that we're receiving as a gift. So you can call them spiritual disciplines, right? These things, Bible reading, prayer, fasting, other things that we do, even confession, community. But another word for them that some people in different traditions use is means of grace. So on the one hand, yes, they are disciplines that I have to do. I get up in the morning and I have to make a choice to do certain things. That's a very discipleship lens. But the flip side of it is these are gifts being given to me that I'm receiving. And these are simply my means of opening up my hands and receiving what God has for me. So discipleship language is, what am I doing? Formation language is, what is God doing? And for me, sometimes that's a deeper reality. And for some of us that maybe were in slightly legalistic contexts or a context where it was about rule following, sometimes that can be almost a freeing idea that this isn't just a process of us trying really hard to be good boys and girls. This is a process of stepping into freedom as a gift that God is giving us. But freedom has to be received and grace has to be received. And so that's kind of when I talk about spiritual formation, I mean, and I'll use a technical definition, the body of Jesus Christ, meaning the church, the community, because this can't be done alone. Nobody does this alone. The body of Jesus Christ being formed according to the image of Jesus Christ by the power of the Holy Spirit in rhythms of incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection. So I'll say that again. They're rhythms of incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection. I'm stealing all of this from Bonhoeffer, by the way. So incarnation means we're humans, and we need to accept that. Because God so accepted our humanity that the incarnation happened, that we got Jesus in Christmas, right? So God so said, hey, it's okay that you're human with all your flaws and all your sins and all your shortcomings. It's so okay. I'm so okay with you being human that I'm going to become one of you. That's the first kind of theological point. The second point is, but the cross is real, and sometimes things have to die. Things like sin, things like oppression, things like when we are in bondage to things like personality traits, even ways we treat other people, unjust political systems. There are things that need to be crucified in this world, right? We affirm them in the incarnation and say, this is good. Humans are good. But the cross is also a big deal, and there are things that need to be put up there. Our guilt, our shame, our sin, our violence, our selfishness, all those things, right? The things that have been done to us, the things we've done to other people. And then the third thing is in the midst of that death, because the cross means death. It's not something that should ever be skipped over. But in the midst of that death are the seeds of new life, resurrection, right? So these, I call it the Christological triad. It's maybe my only original academic contribution. So the Christological triad of incarnation, crucifixion, resurrection are the patterns and rhythms by which we are transformed. We're formed into the image of Jesus. Now, there's one other step, and I know I'm talking a lot, but the other step is this. There's an ethical practice, moral outplay of this, which is not just these theological truths of me accepting my humanity, knowing some things have to die, and finding new life and hope. It's that it allows me to walk through the world and say, oh, kombucha, okay, I'm drinking this kombucha. There's nothing inherently Christian about this kombucha, but I can affirm that it's good. Like, it's probably helping my gut health. And, I can say this is a good thing. But, if I was slamming back a dozen alcoholic kombuchas a day, that might not be the best thing for me. And, I might have to adjust that in my life. And then in the midst of that sacrifice of saying, I really like kombucha, or I really like Four Roses bourbon, or whatever it is, that so our church for the first 3 weeks of January, we do some kind of fast. Everyone does a different fast. Usually it's food related, unless someone has, health issues, whether it's mental or physical health issues. And so during the first 3 weeks of January, I'm going to do like a Ramadan style fast where I don't eat during daylight hours at all, and I'm not drinking any alcohol. So that's what I've purposed to do, because for many reasons. One, more time for prayer and more time for focus and kind of getting on the same page with my Creator and all that, but also that these things that are good, things like bread and wine and sex and music and power and beauty, these things that are good, we know they're good. Oftentimes they can become things that are not good for us, right? They can become addictions, they can become demons, they can become bondages, they can become anything, right? Like, the internet isn't bad, but it can be very bad, right? Like podcasts, I'm sure, can also be bad. But so the crucifixion element allows you ethically to say, yes, I'm going to crucify this element in my life, but I'm going to expect something new to come out of this. And I think if you look back on your life, many of the things that you've given up, that you've opened up your hands and you've said, God, take this from me, or I'm going to put this on the cross or on the altar, or whatever metaphorical language you want to use, a lot of times something even better came out of that, something new, something fresh, something alive.
So many times, dude. So many times. Like, I can attest to that. Like, it's absurd. It's absurd. 2019, worst year of my life. I don't know. It doesn't. We don't need to waste time comparing.
Just ranking.
My dad died when I was 10, but it was bad.
Top three bad year.
Yeah, top two. And we just experienced what you just talked about so many times. Like, what we thought we wanted wasn't what was for us, and then that dies, and then what comes after that was way better, and then. But I'm not talking about like that just happened once. That has been repeating in our life.
It's a pattern.
It is an absolute pattern, and that pattern has sped up for us way quicker in the last 3 to 4 years. Whereas maybe that was I don't even know what the timing, say on average was before that. It was way slower. So that has sped up for us. And at every turn, what came next was better. So you're talking about, okay, this is something that I've never heard of before and never thought of either.
That's the pattern of for all the nerds.
Yeah. This pattern of incarnation, crucifixion, resurrection. Yeah. This is what happened if what we're saying about Jesus is true. Came to earth, became a human, died, resurrected. And that is what happens in our life.
Yeah, as we follow
occasionally,
Jesus.
routinely, as we follow
And
Jesus,
we're formed into his image.
stuff builds up. Dead wood starts laying around, whatever it is, closets get cluttered, whatever. Burns up, and what comes after? Fresh, new life, better.
Yeah.
So
We see it in nature, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. So did God notice that pattern in his creation and then made sure to run Jesus through that pattern? Or was that pattern in creation patterned after the...
Well, if we take John 1 seriously,
You know what I'm saying?
If we take John chapter 1 seriously, everything was made through him and by him and for him. The Logos, the Word. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and everything that was made through him. Nothing that was made without him. Like, that's all in John chapter 1.
Mm-hmm.
So the pattern's already there.
Okay, so...
And the Word became flesh and dwelt among people, right?
Okay. So you think the pattern is... The pattern is a product of God becoming incarnate, dying, and being raised to new life?
I would say it's an expression of God's character and creativity.
Okay, that makes sense.
And Jesus is the image of the invisible God, we believe. So Jesus is the ultimate expression and physical manifestation of who God is in God's self and how God works.
Yes.
So of course we're going to see in Jesus the most obvious, the most front and center. Paul says this about marriage. He's like, that marriage is marriage, but it's actually about the mystery of Jesus and the church. Like, right? So Jesus is the image or the manifestation or the example or the metaphor or the whatever of anything that's true and real and good and beautiful. You're going to find an analogy in Scripture and in who Jesus is. And so, before Jesus of Nazareth was born to Mary and Joseph, before that year, nature was already nature. The sun rose, trees grew, dead things gave life.
That pattern was already happening.
Yeah, but in creation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you explained it as being, this is something that's true to the nature of God, who always was.
Yeah.
This is how God has coded things. It's how God works. It's how he's patterned things. It's how he's kind of created this life, death, new life.
Yeah.
And so that's apparent in nature. That was probably happening in humans that were on earth to some extent even before Jesus got here, right?
I would think so.
Okay. But then Jesus' very life.
Jesus is the peak of the whole story, right? He's He's like the...
Yeah, I don't know why I never...
Well, the only thing I would say is, at least in a theological sense, when you do the whole Adam, Eve, God, garden thing, death doesn't seem to be a part of that. Mm-hmm. Now, there's different interpretations and readings of Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3. I don't want to get into that because it's like there's 100 different people that have 100 different ideas about it. But what I think is true, and Genesis is telling us this, is that humanity as we know it, and life on this planet as we know it, includes death. Because I'm not Adam and I'm not Eve. I wasn't there for that. So everyone since that, at least, right, our parents, our first parents, has experienced death. And so that's part of the deal. Now, in a sense, death is part of the deal. In another sense, Jesus came to conquer death and to put it to an end. And, we hope for a new heaven and a new earth situation where death does not have the same position because it's been defeated, right? That's one of the hopes of the resurrection, that death, it's in there. Death doesn't have the final say.
Exactly. Yes.
It's not an enduring death. It's not it's the last enemy that will be defeated. Mm-hmm. So that's our hope. Our hope is like, hey, in this process, death is part of it, but it doesn't get the final say.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So you mentioned with this, the spiritual formation there is a part here where God is giving these gifts to us. He is forming us. Mm-hmm. What are those gifts?
So I would say gifts such as the fruit of the Holy Spirit, so joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. The presence of God is itself a gift. Mm-hmm. The gift of the assurance of our relationship with God being reconciled in Jesus. The gift of the body of Christ, the community that we experience. The gift of life itself and creativity. The gift of prayer and communion with God, where we can experience kind of the deepest reality. The gift of the sacraments of reminder, the gift of marriage, right, is also a picture of this. The gift of the crazy gift of how children come into the world, like how new life literally happens. Like these are gifts to be received in rhythms. The gift of silence, and so like think about in our world how busy we are and how the phone dominates us and internet and Instagram and all this stuff. And the gift of when you do go on like a retreat or you just like go on a hike or whatever, and the gift of silence and the gift of solitude, these disciplines, we think of them as disciplines, like lifting weights, and in a sense they are. But even like when I just built a portable basketball hoop. I assembled it. It took me a couple days. My parents still give me a little money for my birthday because I guess I'm a child. But so I built this basketball hoop because when I shoot the basketball, when I'm just even by myself, it's like a gift. Mm-hmm. Like I was never a good player. I played in middle school. I couldn't have made the high school team, but I love playing basketball. I love it. I love that. Like some people could be like, oh, exercise. You get in your exercise. Sure. Yeah. I'm getting my heart rates up on my Apple Watch and I'm burning calories, but it's a gift. It's like something I receive, like food, right? Food when eaten with people that you love, table fellowship. These are some of the gifts that they seem like spiritual disciplines. Hearing the word or memorizing the word or opening the word, reading the word, meditating. These are things that we can, on one hand, they are things we commit to do because they're things that will make our life more the way God wants it to be. But they, at the same time, are also gifts. Like having a date night with your spouse, or these are rhythms. But they're also things you have to commit to. You have to be intentional about. You're making sacrifices to make them happen, right? So that's what I would say in terms of like it being both a discipline and receiving of gifts.
So how do we get more of those gifts then? Is that part of what spiritual formation is all about?
Yeah, I think it's opening ourselves up. Like, John Mark Comer wrote this book, The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, talking about how we're more hurried than any people have ever been, ever. So how could we possibly receive the quiet gifts that God wants to give us? The same God that in the Old Testament speaks in the still small voice, not in the fire, not in the storm, right? Still small voice. So it's like, you and I doing this right now, this is a thing. This is a way for us to receive gifts of us telling each other our stories and being real and saying true things, like going and getting a meal with an old friend that you haven't seen in a while, or taking a walk by yourself and talking to God, laying things out. Like, I think as we use them, much like our muscles, our capacity for them grows, right? So even fasting, I don't love fasting, but every time I fast, I feel like I'm like, this just sounds weird, but like getting better at it, like almost like it's a skill, in a way. These things are skills, even though they are also gifts. It's like playing basketball is a lot more fun when you hit most of your shots than when you, like my 6-year-old can't, like he can barely get it up onto an 8-foot rim. But like when he starts to really hit shots, like he's not going to want to stop. Like I used to play basketball for hours on my back patio when we lived in Georgia when I was in middle school. So it's like, that's when those things we take joy in that are also disciplines, like your ice tub sauna routine. Like that's a choice. That's not something you just run into.
It gets easier.
Yeah, but it gets easier, and somehow it gets like more fulfilling, almost like you're getting this great thing out of it. That like, if you didn't do that for a month, you'd probably feel worse. It would be, you would miss it. So that's.
Can I ask you something I was thinking about the other day? Is so the Bible does talk about the fact that God is love, right? God is love.
I think that's in 1 John.
Okay. And then you mentioned some of the other gifts of the Spirit, like patience, kindness, goodness, joy, meekness, gentleness, those types of things. But maybe we can use love as the example, because that's the one where it does say God is love. The Bible doesn't ever say anywhere that God is joy, right? Or God is meekness, or it talks about love maybe a little different than some
I think
of them.
love is probably the thing. Like and Paul says this in the famous wedding, 1 Corinthians 13 passage. It's like the greatest of these is love.
Yep.
Like
okay.
It's the highest kind of Christian virtue, if you want to put it that way.
Yep. So is it, I was thinking about this idea of glorifying God, and I guess, most of the time I've been thinking about glorifying God as like saying, hey, God is good.
Mm-hmm.
God is real. God exists. Glorifying him, or maybe singing,
Yeah.
that type of thing. But is another fair and legitimate way to glorify God by acting in love, or acting in gentleness, or acting in humility? If God is love, or these are traits of God, and we act in these ways, that brings glory sort of to, like, when you act in love, that brings recognition to love. It sort of glorifies love. It amplifies love. And if God is love, when you act in the ways of God, that is another way that you're bringing glory to God. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, human language is limited. So we're speaking English. If we were in Tajikistan, we'd be speaking something else, Tajik probably. So every time we talk about God, we are using limited human language to try to express something that is beyond human language. So we're always going to fall short, in my opinion. Our words are always going to fall short of capturing the actual thing itself. I think that's one of the reasons the Bible uses so many metaphors for God, like shepherd and strong tower and river of life, right? Like a lot of pictures of, like, God's not actually a building. Like, God's not actually a tower, right? But this metaphorical language, as we layer it, we say God is like a tower, and God is like bread, and God is like water, and God is like light, and God is like love. And I think it helps to fill out this concept of love, because a lot of people would be like, well, love looks like me, cheating on my girlfriend. Like, that's not what we're talking about, right? So being careful with our words, as I think one of my professors once said, to be a theologian, because a theologian means someone who says words about God, theos, logos, so someone who talks about God. So being a theologian means watch your mouth in the presence of God. So I'm from New England, and my mother growing up used to say, watch your mouth, which means, like, don't say bad words, or, don't have an attitude. So watching our mouth in the presence of God, meaning let's not just throw God stuff out there without thinking about it, right? Like, not being like, well, God says this and God says that. Let's be, humble about how many verses we're quoting at people and whether we understand the full context of that. But what I will say to you is about the love thing. Jesus, in one of the Gospels, I forget which one it was, probably Luke, he says, he's teaching, and he says, he's talking about what you're talking about, words versus actions. And he says, there's a guy who had 2 sons, and he's like, hey, I need you to go out to the fields and do some work. The first son says, yep, Pop, got it, go do it. And the second one says, I'm not going to do that. But then the first one doesn't go do it, and the second one feels bad and goes and does it. And he says, which one do you think did the will of his father? And, like, it's the one who said, nah, I'm not going to do that, I don't feel like that, but then actually went and did it. And so Jesus seems in many places in the Gospels to say what you're saying is, talking about God is great, and giving God glory with our words is great, but the real deal seems to be what we do with our bodies at an even deeper level. And Jesus talks about this in a lot of different ways, but we also see people in the book of Acts, every time the church gets to a place and is talking to people about God, God already seemed to have been kind of working somehow in those places before the church even got there, right? And we've heard missionary stories time and time again about, like, the work of the Holy Spirit, like that there are things that happen that are greater and deeper and truer than our ability to name them or talk about them. There are some things that just surpass our ability to just put all the labels and put it in a nice, neat box, like being speechless, right? Like, there are times in your life where you are speechless, where you're like, what? Like, I can't even say what just happened. Like, and I think God is at that level of depth that our human language can't fully comprehend his greatness. And so, yes, I love singing singing songs at church. I love praising God. I love talking to my kids about God. I love writing books about God. But ultimately, for me, Augustine said this about 1,600 years ago. St. Augustine, depending on where you're from. He said, the best way to get better at reading the Bible, like to get better at knowing what's in the Bible, is to go love your neighbor. And so what he's saying is, it's actually something that you literally cannot understand unless you're doing it with your life, with your body. Unless you've ever fed the hungry or comforted the sick or done any of these things, reading the Bible is not going to do you much good. You're not going to understand it it's going to be a shallow understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, like in the book that you reference, that is not out yet, the last chapter of that book is called Skills. It's because we need these postures. The three main chapters are postures, knowledge, and skills. Postures are kind of our heart towards God, humility, faith, the way we approach the scripture. That matters way more than our knowledge. Our knowledge matters. Knowledge is the biggest chapter of the book I just wrote. Knowledge, we need to know about background and history and literature and all this stuff. It matters that we understand what's going on. But ultimately, it doesn't really matter if it doesn't manifest in skills, which are the rhythms, the spiritual disciplines, the means of grace, the formational stuff that we've been talking about. Unless it gets worked out in our body, you can tell your wife you love her all day long. Unless you actually show her that love through your actions, it rings a little hollow.
Mm-hmm.
And Paul says that in the 1 Corinthians passage. He says, if I do all these things, but I don't have love, I'm a clanging cymbal. And he really, when he talks about love, he's talking about love is patient. Love is kind. Love is gentle. Those aren't things you can just talk about. Those are things you have to demonstrate, you have to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you're absolutely right on.
So would it be too much of a stretch then to say that one way to help your kids form spiritually is by acting in a way, by orienting your life in the ways of the kingdom of God?
Mm-hmm.
You can teach them. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you do and you should and whatever.
Yeah, but they pay way more attention to how you act.
Yeah.
You know that.
So, so this is, I think maybe I'm also partly trying to justify my my lack of teaching my kids, because that does not come natural for me.
Yeah. I think naming things is helpful. I think maybe I'm giving you parenting advice, which I should not be doing.
Go for it,
more
man.
kids
I'll
and they're
take
older than my kids. It's just like when you're doing that stuff, like just like when I'm like leaving my kids on a Wednesday night saying, I'm going to hang out with my friends. I'm just intentionally just telling them what's going on. And if like, excuse me, if you are loving your kids self-sacrificially, like just naming that, being like, hey, just so you know, I don't really feel like doing this right now, but like I'm doing this out of gratitude for what God has given me, which includes you. And I just want to say that out loud. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think the actions are more important than the words, but I think the words can help them understand the actions.
Yes. That makes sense. Okay. Bonhoeffer, to me personally, has to be like one of the most well-known people in Christian history that I know the least about. It's weird.
Yeah.
It's weird how little I know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I don't know why this is. I've never read a book on him. I've never read a book that he's written.
Yeah.
I hear his name a lot. It seems like he has a lot to offer. Why is he? Can you tell us a little bit about him, and why in particular did his thinking or his writing stick so well?
So words and actions, right? Words and actions. He lived what he talked about, what he wrote about. So he was.
Do you think that's primarily why his teachings have stuck? So
he lived it, just like Martin Luther King Jr. in a different way. So both Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther King Jr. died in the month of April of their 39th year. These were obviously in different years. For Bonhoeffer, it was 1945. For Martin Luther King Jr., it was 1968.
Really? But both were April of their
39th year. They both held PhDs in theology. They were both pastors. They both wrote and they both led social movements against evil, just in different ways. So,
how old are you?
38.
Me too. Next April. Except I have no PhD. Well, you have the PhD.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'll make sure I get to know your boys.
Yeah. I certainly hope not. So Martin Luther King, we're more educated about him in general because he was an American, and so the civil rights movement and the communities that he led were explicitly following Jesus. But Dietrich Bonhoeffer was doing something a little different because in Nazi Germany, you couldn't march on the streets against Hitler. They would just kill you. So there was at least some restraint in the United States that was not present in Nazi Germany. So a lot of stuff had to happen underground.
There was restraint in Nazi Germany that wasn't present in America, right?
No, restraint of like they might unleash the dogs at you or fire hose you.
Got it. Restraint on the other side.
But
Got
like
it.
the government is probably not going to just mass murder you.
Yeah.
So not great, but a little different than Nazi Germany. If you're like down with Hitler, it's like no one sees you ever again. And that's just how that goes. So Bonhoeffer's kind of movement against social evil had to be more underground. So he ran like an illegal underground seminary because a big question in the German church is, are we going to sign this thing called the Aryan paragraph, which was basically like, if you're not full-blooded Aryan, whatever that means, if you have any Jewish ancestry, you can't be part of the church leadership, you can't be a pastor. So it was basically racial segregation laws, but through the mechanism of the church. And there were a lot of people who were really uncomfortable because the German church, German Lutheran church, the Protestant church in Germany was much like what the Church of England is still to this day, where it's like you're being paid by the government. Like it is a state church. Like if the government doesn't like you, you don't make money. Like you get kicked out. And so this is like a career, there are pluses and minuses to this. But if you resisted the Nazis as a pastor in Germany in 1941, like you're done. Like you're getting sent to the front lines. like this happened to some of Bonhoeffer's students. So I can't tell you the whole story, but he gets affected as a young man growing up by his brother dying in World War I, going to Rome and seeing Catholicism as an 18-year-old, deciding to study theology, eventually becoming a pastor, studying, reading some of the stuff that Karl Barth wrote against the super liberal German theologians at the time who were kind of collapsing Christianity into humanity. This is a very Reader's Digest version. He ends up going to New York, Bonhoeffer does, as a young man in 1930, around there. And white Christianity to him is like kind of this weak, mamby-pamby self-help. But then he encounters black Christianity in Harlem, New York. And he's like, this is Christianity. And this
Really?
And this is where he has his encounter with Jesus. So he would say, I was a theologian and I was a pastor, but I wasn't a Christian, and now I am.
Really?
Yeah. So
how old is he at this point?
So he was born, let's see, at 45. He was born in 1906, so this is 24. And he already has a PhD, by the way. He already has a PhD, and he's published a couple of academic things. But yeah, he has this, just like John Wesley was a pastor, and then he has this experience where he felt strangely warmed. That was his kind of him and Jesus moment. In a very similar way, Bonhoeffer has sometime in the 1930 corridor there has, and I believe, and other scholars believe, it was because of Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. So here's this German dude who speaks English, but probably with a heavy accent, teaching like young African-American kids Sunday school, like in Harlem. New York? Yeah, in New York. Like getting involved in the choir and stuff.
For how long?
Just for a year. He was he was there for because he was on like a student visiting kind of program fellowship visa thing at Union Theological Seminary in New York. So it changes his life, and he comes back to Berlin and he starts lecturing at the University of Berlin, which is a very dry theological and he starts asking people bizarre questions like, do you love Jesus? That was not a question you asked at the University of Berlin in a theology class. That's besides the point. It doesn't matter whether or not I love Jesus. He's bringing this is the term, Negro spirituals. He's bringing early black roots gospel music and playing it on like gramophones for his students who are like, what is this? They're used to this very middle class, polished German version of Jesus, and they're getting this downtrodden black African-American Jesus.
He's playing Negro spirituals back in Germany.
Yeah.
After he returned back there.
Yeah, he brought them with him. He bought records and brought them.
Wow.
Yeah, he's blowing people's minds.
Wow, he's blowing my mind.
Yeah, and they're like, what is this? And so he's challenging his students to throw off their kind of like European, stodgy, middle class kind of suit wearing Jesus, and challenging their kind of conceptions and saying, this is a whole nother deal. Like this black Christianity in New York, like changed him. And so there's a whole book about this called Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, written by a friend of mine, Reggie Williams. Brilliant book, really well done. And it's an academic book, but it's pretty readable. And he goes through all the black theology that was coming out of the United States, out of like segregation, slavery, all that stuff, and how that impacted the church and the pastor that Bonhoeffer was kind of sitting under his teaching. And so how it was super revolutionary theologically for Bonhoeffer. to meet a Jesus who was like poor. Like people didn't talk about Jesus as like being poor, you know, or cast aside or margin, you know, just that wasn't kind of in the zeitgeist at the time. That wasn't like popular. So anyway, all that, he comes back to Germany. He waffles a bit of like, what should he do? He wants to go see Gandhi because he's really interested in this peace ethic of like nonviolence. But he takes a job in England because things are starting to heat up with the Nazis and things are getting uncomfortable. And Bonhoeffer's family is kind of known to not be huge fans of Hitler because they're very old school German. Like they're like, who's this newfangled Hitler guy? We don't like him, you know, because he's very like breaking with tradition. He's like, this is the new Germany, right? So,
and has World War II started yet or no?
No, not yet. And so this is in the 30s. As the tension rises, he goes to London for a year. He pastors a German-speaking congregation. Already, dissidents, communists, Jews, Jewish Christians are starting to get out of Germany because they kind of see the writing on the wall in, like, let's say 1933, 1934. And he's pastoring in London, and he has a choice whether to go see Gandhi. He wrote Gandhi, got a letter back. Gandhi was like, hey, come hang out with me. And he had to choose whether to do that or to go back into Germany, because the church split. It's called the Kirchenkampf, which is the church struggle had happened, where the confessing church, which was basically like non-Hitler, non-Nazi, non-Aryan, they kind of had to go underground. And so he was commissioned. He was asked if he would run a seminary, an illegal underground seminary, to train pastors who were not official. And he chose that.
Who would have commissioned him to do that?
The confessing church, which was like they broke off of what became known as the Deutsche Christen, the German Christians, like kind of nationalist, pro-Hitler. So they kind of were organizing these quiet ways of continuing to train pastors, equip them, and quietly plant churches and stuff like that. So this is all illegal, not on the up and up with the state. So he goes to a place called Finkenwalde and does that for 2 years. He trains pastors. He makes friends. They start a community called the House of the Brethren, House of the Brothers. That gets shut down by the Gestapo in 1937. Mm-hmm. He starts going underground. He becomes like a double agent spy guy. Very interesting story. There's been some okay movies made about it. There still needs, like, the big, great Bonhoeffer movie still has not been made. And I know a lot of people in Hollywood that would like to make it, but nobody can agree on how to do it. So that's how Hollywood tends to work. But he becomes a double agent. He's feeding information as World War II starts. He's feeding information to the British through his ecumenical church contacts, like in different countries and stuff like that.
So he's become a double agent at this point? He's become essentially a spy for the Allies?
Basically, he's still a German, but he's feeding information to the Allies.
Just because he felt like
he was able to get a
more
job
on the right side of history?
Yeah, he knew Hitler was wrong, and he knew Germany was wrong, and he knew bad things were happening. And he had stood up publicly, and then everyone was like, you should probably stop that, so he went underground with it. I see. So he was part of the conspiracy that tried to assassinate Hitler. Let me be clear. Bonhoeffer did not personally try to kill Adolf Hitler. That's a straw man that people... There's a big argument of whether he affirmed the assassination attempt on Hitler. I'm on the side that says, yes, he did. There's another side of scholars that say, no, he didn't. It's a big mess. But I'm not saying he tried to kill Hitler. What I'm saying is he was part of the circle of people who conspired to try to blow up a room that Hitler was going to be in, and it failed. Like the whole Valkyrie plot was an offshoot of that conspiracy circle. So anyway, so he's a double agent kind of guy. He's still writing letters, and he gets an opportunity to go back to the United States. I skipped that part. He gets an opportunity to go back to the United States right before the war is breaking out, like 1938, like 1939. And he goes back to the United States, and he hates it. And he's like, I'm in the wrong place. This is not what God wants. And this is when you had to get on a boat. Like, this is not like just get on a plane, right? He had to get on a boat. So he gets on a boat. He comes across. He's in New York. They're hooking him up with a job. He has contacts. He has people that are going to, like, he's going to be safe. He's going to be able to ride out the war. And later, the apartment he was staying in New York, they found the entire floor was covered in cigarette butts. He was just chain smoking. He just was a wreck. And he almost immediately decided, I have to go back. And he gets on literally the last boat back to Germany that you could take from New York back to Germany before the war breaks out. Goes back, decides to suffer with his people, decides to support his people, do the double agent thing, be part of the conspiracy. Eventually gets arrested before he could finish his magnum opus, which is called Ethics, which is what I wrote my dissertation about, his book Ethics. He gets put in a Nazi prison for a couple of years. He's writing letters. They become known as letters and papers from prison, which influence people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu in their fight against apartheid in South Africa, like the whole Nelson Mandela and all that.
Who's he writing these letters to?
His family, his friends, other pastors, because he has so many students that were part of what he had taught, encouraging people a lot to his family and friends and to his...
Not so much world leaders.
No, just people he knows.
Okay.
And because he has to have them smuggled out.
Mm.
He has to have like a deal with the guards and all that. So as things are wrapping up, Hitler learns of the plot against his life, and he discovers that a lot of Bonhoeffer's family and friends are involved. And towards the very end of the war, as Hitler knows he's losing because the Russians are like breathing down the east side of Berlin's neck, so to speak, Hitler wants everyone to be dead who had conspired against him, because he knows he doesn't have long to do that, and he's Hitler, so he wants to take everybody out. So Bonhoeffer was transferred to a concentration camp at Flossenburg, and shortly after Easter, he preached an Easter sermon for himself and some of the other prisoners that were there, and then they hung him by piano wire, and so he died 2 weeks before the concentration camp was liberated by the Russians.
Whoa.
So that's one of the reasons people care about his story, because it's pretty riveting.
Uh-huh.
And he totally lived. And the guy who was with him was a British captain who said, I've never seen someone go to their death more peacefully.
Hmm.
And Bonhoeffer is quoted as saying the final thing he ever said to the doctor, because a Nazi doctor would attend the executions. He said, this is the end, but for me, it's the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. So is he so sort of commemorated, remembered, found helpful kind of in the years since because of his willingness to sort of, put his mouth where his money was, so to speak?
Exactly.
Like, okay, is that the big idea, or was he...
It's that, and his ideas are incredible. Like that whole incarnation, crucifixion, resurrection thing.
That's his idea?
That's him. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I just totally ripped that off from him. I say that in my book. Yeah, that's the whole thesis. He says stuff about Christian community. Like if you read Life Together, I think every Christian should read his book, Life Together. It's a very simple book. You can do a 4-week study with a small group, and just read each of the chapters. And he just so masterfully brings together all the things we've been talking about: spiritual formation, word, sacrament, community, confession, habits, rhythms, formation, all that stuff. He is, if he hadn't died, I think he still would have gone down as one of the top 5 theologians of the 20th century, because he was 39 when he died. Let's say he wrote for another 40 years. Who knows? But because he did die, you have that whole blood of the martyrs thing. You have the whole, the captivating aspect of his life and his story, and his students wanting to carry on his legacy, which they did.
So was sort of the center point of his teaching or emphasis, was it community, discipleship, formation?
This is going to sound really Sunday school, but it was the person of Jesus Christ.
Okay.
So for him, discipleship / formation, which is his first book that is considered a spiritual practice, the book called The Cost of Discipleship, that's kind of his personal, how do we follow Jesus? How do we then Life Together is his next book, which is how do we do this together? How do we actually do this? And for him, those two things are intimately related, because you can't do it alone. And he takes as seriously as any thinker I've ever seen the fact that the church is called the body of Christ. So let me give you a really practical outworking. If anyone ever is part of your church community and comes on Sundays and goes to small group, and something's going on in their marriage and they want pastoral counsel, and they say, hey, I'm not here for anybody to tell me how to do my marriage. I'm not here for anybody to tell me how to raise my kids. Don't tell me don't tell me how to raise my kids. Don't tell me what to do with my money, right? They're not just saying that to the church. They're saying that to the body of Jesus Christ. And it is my contention, and I don't pretend churches are perfect, so to the extent that they are embodying Jesus, that's my caveat here, is please tell me how to raise my kids. Please tell me what to do with my money. Please tell me what to do with my marriage. Because when I said yes to Jesus, and I said, yes, you are my Lord, you are my Savior, you are my friend, you are my God. When I said yes to Jesus, I was also saying yes to his body. And what Bonhoeffer says is the primary manifestation, physical manifestation of Jesus Christ on planet Earth is the body of Christ, the community of the church. Not that God's not anywhere else, the Holy Spirit and creation and all that other stuff, but where we experience this formative reality the most directly is in the body, in the community. Doing it by yourself is a American cowboy, vision gone wrong. Like, you can't be the Lone Ranger and do the Jesus thing because you're part of his body. Like Paul says, feet and hands and mouths and eyes, and we are all doing different things. We need each other. And so that's what that book, Life Together, is. And then his final book that he didn't get to finish, Ethics, which I think is still probably his most brilliant book because he's doing like really academic ethics. He's doing it. So it's a whole nother level kind of thing. He's talking about how Christians should live in a world that's falling apart. Because for him, the world was falling apart because you're living in Nazi Germany. So it's how do you make the tough decisions, and how do you cling to Jesus, and how do you do this over a long period of time, and how do you become the kind of person that can make those decisions? And is it
You
about
wrote a book on that?
Yeah, it's called Ethics.
Oh, okay.
So, but he didn't get to finish it because he got arrested in 43, I think it was. He got arrested before he could finish it. So
you've studied him.
Yeah.
If he were to come back and spend a year here, traveling across our country, spending time in all of the different churches, what do you think is his assessment?
I think he would say you have a lot of cultural kind of stuff that you do and you call it Christianity. Like, he said it when he was here in the 30s. He said there's a lot of stuff that people are doing that has nothing to do with the gospel. It's just like self-help, kind of like feel better about yourself. And I think he would diagnose the culture. He would say you have all these things going on. Everyone's buying things all the time. Everyone's busy all the time. Nobody has friends. I think he would diagnose a lot of stuff that we've been talking about. And I think he would be like, I think you should return to the gospel. And I think one thing, a friend of mine, Joel Looper, just wrote a book called A Land Without Reformation. Bonhoeffer's America, A Land Without Reformation. Basically with this thesis, so this is not my thesis, it's Joel's, is Bonhoeffer would probably say, as he said when he came here in the 30s, you've allowed your politics to determine your churches and not the other way around. So
who said that?
This is my friend Joel wrote this book about Bonhoeffer, where Bonhoeffer basically says this when he comes to America. He's like, you're allowing your political realities to dictate your churches. Remember when we were talking about like the Methodists were on horses and the Episcopalians were on. So Europe was already set, right? So the church actually determined politics in Europe, which is its whole other mess, right? I'm not saying that's better, but our politics determined our churches. So the way our churches grew and the siloing that you were talking about, and the way that people would preach or not preach in big tent revivals or Baptists or Episcopalians, like, our churches tend to follow our political culture. So, and you see that more and more and more, where there are more and more churches that these are red churches and these are blue churches, or these, like, one of the things I like about Church of the City, where I'm involved, is like, if you look at the three campuses, we're across the political spectrum. Like, the downtown campus voted a certain way, and the Franklin campus voted like probably not that way, and then the Spring Hill campus definitely didn't vote that way. but we're in communion and fellowship, and our pastors are part of fellowship with each other, and there's a kind of a sisterhood, brotherhood kind of a thing of like I think Bonhoeffer would say you need to put politics on the back burner, put it outside the church, and do the gospel, and let the gospel dictate your politics, which is probably going to make everyone mad at you. It's probably going to make the blue people mad and the red people mad and the purple people. It's probably going to make everyone mad because Jesus' politics made everyone mad. You're probably going to say stuff that's going to offend everybody. And I think that would be one of his main critiques. And once again, I'm stealing that from Joel Looper, who just wrote this book about Bonhoeffer in America. So
we want that certainty, man. We get that certainty in politics too.
Yeah, and we want to be on the team, right? We want to be on a team that makes us feel certain and like we belong, and gives us all the answers in one, nightly news program or one tweet or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And then we've covered it all, and we can feel really good about ourselves, and we don't have to do anything.
Mm-hmm. One of the values of religion, I heard this from someone who's not particularly religious and not a follower of Jesus, but I think I agree with it, one of the benefits of religion is it encourages long-term thinking. If you couldn't be a Christian, what religion would you be most apt to subscribe to? Or maybe to put it another way, what other religion do you think is closest to the truth?
I mean, I'd probably be Jewish.
Okay.
That's cheating, kind of.
Yeah, that is a little cheating, isn't it?
Is too. I'd probably be Jewish because it's like, well, Jesus was Jewish. So,
yeah.
I think Jewish people, like, it's incredible that Jews have survived despite people just trying to kill them all the time.
It's remarkable. And it's remarkable, particularly when you consider how tiny their country is.
Yeah. And even before 1948 or whatever, they didn't have a country. So they were scattered throughout the world.
True, too.
And they're way disproportionately, like, they win Nobel Prizes in science, and, you know, they're physicists and medical doctors. Like,
it's crazy.
Like, so Abraham was called to be a blessing to the world, right? God was like, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to number the stars, all that stuff. And, like, Jewish people in general are a blessing to the world. Like, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but when you look at the like percentage of people who are doing amazing things to mitzvot is the word, good deeds in Hebrew. Like, they're doing mitzvah, they're doing good work, they're doing work that matters in science and medicine and law. It's like, and that's, once again, I'm not trying to make them magical. Like, no group of people was magical, but it is an attractive. If someone were like, hey, here's proof that Jesus wasn't the Messiah, I'd be like, all right, well, maybe he'll just go be Jewish. Other than that, I think, like, if I wanted to be a secular humanist and be like a cool kid, I'd probably be like a Buddhist, because you can, like, kind of make Buddhism what you want it to be a little bit.
Yeah.
You can kind of, like, I knew a lot of people in LA who are like, I'm Buddhist. I'm like, are you?
Oh, really?
But
I'm just realizing that I actually don't know a lot about the other religions.
There's a good book called God Is Not One, by a guy named Stephen Prothero. He was a professor at Boston University, which I did not go to. But he was shocked about 15 years ago that his students started to come into all his classes, and he's a religion professor, not a Christian, not a theologian, but a religion professor. And he was like, nobody knows anything about the religions anymore. So he wrote a book called Religious Illiteracy, and then he wrote another book called God Is Not One. And religious illiteracy is just about how no one knows anything about religion anymore in the United States. And, like, here are the facts we need to know about the major religions. The second one is his argument that no, all the religions are not the same. They're actually asking different questions and proposing different solutions to those questions. So, like, Buddhism is proposing an answer to the question, how do we end suffering? How do we avoid suffering? How do we get rid of suffering? And the answer is detachment. So we need to detach from the physical material world because it's not real. The ultimate reality is the kind of nirvana that you're trying to seek through meditation and through, you know, following the teachings of the Buddha. So it's just a completely different set of questions than Christianity. Christianity's big question is like, what do we do about sin and, you know, and evil? Like, how do we do, you know?
But there's still, like, overlap. That's what's a little bit fascinating, you know? Like,
I knew a Christian Buddhist at Boston College.
Really?
Yeah. So someone who she'd grown up Christian and then she converted to Buddhism, but she didn't leave her Buddhism behind. I probably couldn't pull that off, to be honest. Like, I like having a home. Like, I'm pretty committed to the way of Jesus.
Can't be in two rooms at once.
Yeah. I like to be in a room, you know, but I can see there are practices. There are definitely practices in Buddhism that you're like, oh, Jesus meditated and Jesus, you know, had these, you know, quiet times, and Jesus did let go of, like, the material kind of things of this world being the ultimate thing, you know. So there is definitely, I'm not saying all the religions of the world have nothing in common. There's certainly some major things, but I just think it gets a little simplistic when people are like, well, they're all the same.
Right.
It's like, well, then why do we have all of them?
Yep. I'm trying to get a few free questions in here at the end.
Let's
but
go. Split it into two.
Yeah. What is your assessment on the probability of there being life in places outside of planet Earth?
I have no idea.
Okay.
So, I mean, I don't have any psychological motivation to believe one way or the other, right? So I think God can do whatever God wants to do.
Do you think the Bible tends to give indications one way or another, or do you think it's just an area it's not?
I think the Bible's talking about this planet.
Yeah.
So for the most part. So for me, I'm just like, hey, that's kind of like outside of my pay grade.
Mm-hmm.
But
you don't see the Bible particularly suggesting that there is, or particularly out, you know, what do you even like rolling it out?
Yeah, I don't think it addresses it. I think there's a couple of weird things in Genesis and a couple of weird things in Revelation and a couple of things in between.
You don't say.
Yeah. and I think when we focus on that stuff, we start to take our eye off the ball. Like, how many people do you know who are like, it's the end times? And I'm like, do you love anybody? Like, do you follow just, but the world's going to end. I need to buy all this.
I've been hearing that since I can remember, which was about the mid 80s.
Yeah. Hey, and I always say to people, I'm like, okay, the world hasn't ended yet. And I think the world will probably eventually end, and I don't know exactly how Jesus is going to come back, but I'm a Christian, so that's part of being a Christian. But what I will say is, I think the people during the Black Plague probably had like a way better case for like the world is ending. It's like half the people in England died, a third of the people in Europe died. They probably like had a lot more reason to be like, it's all coming down. We're like, my phone, my 5G isn't working. Like, it's the end times. It's like, what are you talking? Like, there are chips. People are putting chips. It's like, I think you're reading like maybe one sentence. You're maybe reading a bit into that.
Yeah, just a little. But don't you think too that could be part of the cycle of like life and then death and then new life? Like,
sure,
we have thought the world was ending before, and then it got better in some ways and maybe worse in some others. But yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I guess all that I was trying to say is, I think when people freak out because they're like, Russia's going to destroy the world, it's like, okay, well, I see that. There are nukes. We never had nukes before. So that's a thing. That's new. But I try not to get obsessed with like current day political readings of either Genesis or Revelation. I try to be like, hey, let me learn what maybe the original audience may have learned from this and try to put myself in their place rather than try to make it about like Kim Jong-il or something.
Yes, exactly.
But aliens totally on the table. I don't think the Bible takes them off the table.
Yeah. Okay. What do you think is a helpful but currently undervalued or overlooked element to human flourishing in the modern American male? What comes to mind?
Friends. Having friends. Just having friends. Being like, I'm going to actually put myself out there and make friends and then show up on a regular basis and talk to them about my life. I think that is like the unmined, gold vein. It's like I preached a couple weekends ago at my church, and I used some statistics that just came out over the last year or so. But the number of American males that say they have zero friends has quadrupled. The percentage has quadrupled since 1990. So in the last like 30 years, 4 times as many men would tell you, I don't have any friends like that I could talk to. Like, that is a pandemic. That is not good.
Yeah.
That is not good.
Do you think, and why do you think?
I think technology, geography, the pandemic certainly has not helped. But I think it's just harder for people to look each other in the eye and be like, I am a flawed human being, because we're all curating our brands and our apps and our personalities, and we're all doing so much virtual like my friends on Facebook that I never talk to, and I don't care what they think. But it's like, my real friends are the 6 guys I see most Wednesday nights. And it's like, that's harder. You have to show up. You have to be some kind of real version of yourself, or it all falls apart. Like Bonhoeffer says in Life Together, he says, the biggest destroyer of actual community is ideal community. What he means is everyone's running around looking for the perfect ideal.
Bonhoeffer said that?
Yeah.
Ooh.
So everyone's running around trying to get the perfect community, and they're destroying actual community by doing that, because they're always holding out for like, find an imperfect friend that's just trying to like follow Jesus and like that you can trust on a basic level. Don't find like a sociopath that you can't trust, but just that you can talk to, and just be like, hey, I know this is weird, but I would like to be your friend, and I would like to tell you the truth about my life, and I feel like I can trust you. Is that too weird? Like, a few weeks ago, I put together this group of guys just because I had hung out with each of them, and they're all cool, and I liked them, but I have young kids, and I was like, man, I can't hang out with these guys as much as I would really like to. Like, I'm so limited in my time. And then I just put them all on a text chain together. And I know friendships are going to be born out. I mean, ironically, some of them had already been friends from college. I didn't know that. It was kind of like one of those weird things. But it's like, I was like, I need friends. These guys need friends. I can't be friends with everybody, but like I can cultivate it and I can encourage it and just be like, these are great guys. Some of them don't have the chance to hang out on Wednesday nights like I do. I know because a lot of them have asked me about it. Like, hey, can I come join this thing? And I'm like, well, I can't do that because this is like a 3.5 year long kind of formation thing that's been happening. So I can't just bring a bunch of dudes and then it just becomes like a church. So it's like, but what we can do is we can replicate it. And we can have like a monthly coffee meeting with this group of 4 or 5 dads that go to our church that have young kids. And I think it's that. I think it's that right there.
Last question. What would you say is one currently culturally normative practice that history is not going to smile upon?
Man, that's a landmine. Culturally normative practice that history is not going to smile on. How do I say this without getting canceled?
You can't get canceled, man. No one even knows what that means anymore. Don't even worry about it.
No, it's true. I think the way we educate boys, I think we're failing boys as a society. I mean, I know that from statistics. So boys are getting crushed by girls in every category, K through graduate school. Now, men still hold a lot of the institutional leftover power of the patriarchy and all that, and dudes being in control of companies and militaries and presidencies forever. At the tippity top, men still dominate, like the 1%. But everywhere else, boys are getting just crushed because society isn't set up for them. So that's my safe answer. I have like 8 other answers, but that's the one I'm willing to talk about. How we educate boys.
Yeah, I'm glad I asked. All right. Well, where can people find you?
Ryan M. Huber. My middle name is Michael. So RYANM Huber .com on Instagram, Twitter. If you Google me, you'll find my book and a couple of the Substacks that I've done on Bonhoeffer. Substack is just like an email service on Bonhoeffer and on spiritual formation. And if you go to Church of the City downtown on YouTube, I preach every quarter or so. That's where I am. And dude, I'm very grateful that you took your time and waited for me to drive across the city.
Oh, heck yeah.
And hosted me.
Yeah, dude, thank you. Tell Matt Smallbone I said hi, by the way. He might remember me.
I will.
He might not.
No, I'm sure he will.
But
he's a 7 on the Enneagram. He's very
we may be past enough of time for the Titans to lose again, possibly 10 o'clock.
You know, I'm going to predict a win. I'm going to say they won while we were talking.
Who are they even playing tonight?
The Cowboys. They probably did not.
Oh, are they really playing the Cowboys tonight?
So.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm probably wrong.
Yep. All right, Ryan, thanks for being on the podcast. Appreciate it very much.
Thanks, dude.
Good night, everybody.
Try to catch me howling at the moon.